Montana Territory, 1868. The sun cast long shadows across the valley as Ethan Irving guided his horse down the winding trail toward Whiterock. Dust caked his weathered boots and the hem of his canvas pants, testament to the 3 days he'd spent in the saddle. At 25, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who'd lived twice those years, each line on his tanned face earned through harsh seasons and harsher losses. The approaching settlement looked like every other frontier town he'd drifted through, a collection of wooden structures clinging to existence against the vast wilderness that threatened to reclaim them. A place to resupply, maybe earn enough coin for the next stretch of trail, then move on before anyone learned his name or the weight he carried. "That is all a man like me deserves," Ethan whispered to his paint horse, Storm. Just passing through, no roots, no promises. Storm snorted as if in disagreement, but Ethan paid it no mind. The horse hadn't watched Ethan's parents wither away from fever on their failed homestead. Hadn't seen how quickly frontier dreams could turn to unmarked graves. Hadn't felt the weight of responsibility crush a 12-year-old boy who suddenly had to fend for himself in a land that devoured the weak. No, a drifting cowhand was all Ethan could be. 13 years of survival had taught him that lesson well. Attachment was weakness, caring led to loss. The West was no place for softness. It demanded hardness, solitude, and a willingness to ride away when the shadows of the past grew too long. As Whiterock's weathered sign came into view, Ethan adjusted his worn hat and straightened in the saddle. He needed work. His last dollar had gone to a meal the previous day, and Storm deserved better feed than the sparse spring grass. A few weeks' labor would fill his pockets enough to keep moving. That was all he needed, all he allowed himself to want. The town's main street bustled with more activity than he'd expected. Wagons lined the thoroughfare, and the sound of hammers rang out from the far end where a new building was taking shape. Prosperity, it seemed, had found this remote corner of the territory. Ethan guided Storm toward the hitching post outside the mercantile, his gaze sweeping the boardwalk for any sign of trouble. "Well now, ain't you a trail-worn sight?" called a voice from the store's porch. Ethan turned to see an older man with a silver beard leaning against the railing, pipe smoke curling around his weathered face. "Just looking for honest work, sir," Ethan replied, dismounting with the fluid grace that came from living more on horseback than off. "Heard the Peterson Ranch might be hiring." The old man chuckled. "Peterson Ranch, is it? Well, you're in luck. Old man Peterson just bought another 100 head and needs hands who know cattle." He extended a gnarled hand. "Name's Jackson. I run this store when I'm not minding everyone's business." Ethan shook the offered hand, careful to keep his expression neutral. "Ethan Irving, much obliged for the information. Peterson Place is about 5 miles north. Can't miss it, biggest spread in the county now." Jackson studied him with shrewd eyes. "Though you might want to wash some of that trail dust off before you present yourself. Martha over at the boarding house has hot water and fair prices." Ethan nodded, suddenly aware of his appearance. His lean frame carried only what muscle was necessary for the work, and beneath the trail grime, his features held a certain quiet handsomeness he paid little attention to. The stubble on his jaw was light. He'd never been able to grow a full beard like many of the men he'd ridden with, but it had been days since he'd seen a razor or proper soap. "Thank you, Mr. Jackson. I believe I'll do that." As Ethan led Storm toward the livery stable, he couldn't shake the feeling that Whiterock might be different from the dozen other towns he'd drifted through. Something in the air, perhaps, a sense of permanence that made his instincts twitch. It didn't matter, he reminded himself. A few weeks' work, then back to the trail. The world had no place for a man with nothing to offer but the strength in his back and the skills in his hands. And Ethan Irving had made his peace with that long ago. Teresa Palmer stood at the window of her father's general store, watching dust devils dance across the street with a restlessness that matched her own. At 21, she had grown weary of Whiterock's familiar rhythms and faces. Her emerald green eyes, so like her mother's, everyone said, scanned the horizon as if seeking escape in the distant mountains. "Tessa, would you mind organizing those fabric bolts?" Her father's voice broke through her reverie. "Mrs. Jameson will be by later to choose material for her daughter's wedding dress." Tessa turned, tucking a strand of golden blonde hair behind her ear. Her hair fell in soft waves past her shoulders when not pinned up, as it was now for work. Her simple blue cotton dress, though practical for the store, had been tailored to fit her slender frame perfectly, one of the few indulgences her father permitted. "Yes, Papa," she replied, moving toward the shelves of colorful fabrics. Richard Palmer had raised Tessa alone since her mother died of pneumonia when Tessa was just 8. He had done his best, but there remained a hollow place in both their hearts that neither time nor prosperity had filled. The store had thrived under his meticulous management, becoming the heart of Whiterock's commerce, yet Tessa sometimes felt like inventory herself, carefully maintained but ultimately intended for someone else's use. "I was thinking," her father said, adjusting his spectacles as he reviewed the ledger, "that young Thomas Wilson has been showing particular interest in the store lately, and in you." Tessa's hands stilled on a bolt of blue calico. "Thomas Wilson is interested in your ledgers, Papa. He sees me as an agreeable addition to a business arrangement." Her father looked up, his expression softening. "Is that so terrible, Tessa? He comes from a good family. He would provide well, and you would never want for anything." "Except choice," she said quietly, then immediately regretted the sharpness in her tone. "I'm sorry, Papa. I know you want what's best for me." Richard sighed, closing the ledger. "Your mother had that same fire in her eyes when she disagreed with me," he smiled sadly. "I only worry, Tessa, this is not an easy place for a woman alone." Tessa crossed to her father and placed a gentle hand on his arm. "I know. But I cannot marry without love, Papa, not even for security." She glanced out the window at the rugged landscape. "There must be more to life than safe choices." Before her father could respond, the bell above the door jingled. Mrs. Henson bustled in, her considerable frame wrapped in a shawl despite the spring warmth. "Richard Palmer, have you heard about the cattle drive coming through next month? They say it's the largest herd since before the war." The woman barely paused for breath as she approached the counter. "We'll need to stock extra supplies. Those cowboys eat like they've never seen food before." Tessa smiled politely and returned to the fabrics, arranging them by color and texture with the artistic eye her mother had passed down to her. As Mrs. Henson's gossip washed over the store, Tessa allowed her mind to wander again. Unlike many girls she knew, Tessa had read voraciously from her father's small library and the books ordered specially from back east. She understood the limited paths available to women on the frontier, marriage or spinsterhood with few exceptions. Yet something within her rebelled against accepting either fate without question. She wanted adventure before settlement. Passion before practicality. To be chosen for herself, not for her father's store or her ability to keep a home. Was that truly so unreasonable? The bell jangled again as Mrs. Henson departed with her purchases and gossip. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, catching dust motes in golden beams. "I'm going to deliver Mrs. Mitchell's order," Tessa announced, gathering the package her father had prepared earlier. "Then I'll stop by and check on Mrs. Adams. Her baby is due any day now." Richard nodded, his expression softening as it always did when Tessa showed her nurturing side. "Take the wagon if you're going that far out. And be back before sundown." "Yes, Papa," she replied, pressing a kiss to his cheek before collecting her shawl. Outside, Whiterock bustled with its midday activities. Tessa climbed onto the small delivery wagon, settling the packages securely before taking the reins. As she guided the horse down the main street, she nodded politely to familiar faces, maintaining the composed demeanor expected of Richard Palmer's daughter. No one needed to know that beneath her proper exterior beat a heart yearning for something indefinable. Something more than Whiterock could offer, something she feared she might never find. 3 days later, Ethan stood in the Peterson ranch yard, muscles aching pleasantly from honest work. The foreman had hired him on the spot when Ethan demonstrated his skill with horses and calm handling of cattle. Now, in the fading light, he surveyed the sprawling operation with grudging appreciation. James Peterson had built something impressive, a main house constructed of solid timber, bunkhouses for the hands, corrals and stables that spoke of careful planning, and grazing land that stretched toward distant foothills. It was the kind of place Ethan's father had dreamed of establishing before the harsh Montana winter of '55 had claimed both him and Ethan's mother. "Irving, the boss wants to see you," called Hank, the foreman who'd hired him. Ethan straightened, brushing dust from his clothes. "Something wrong?" Hank shook his head. "Nah, probably wants you to look at that new stallion. Peterson mentioned how you handled that bay mare nobody else could get near." With a nod, Ethan headed toward the main house, removing his hat as he approached. His 3 days of work had already earned him a reputation as a man who understood animals, who could settle the most skittish horse with patient hands and quiet words. It was a gift he rarely acknowledged, just another skill that kept him employed and moving. The Peterson homestead stood as a testament to frontier prosperity, 2 stories of sturdy construction with a wide porch that wrapped around the front and one side. Glass windows, real glass, not old paper, caught the evening light. Flowers grew in neat beds along the walkway, a woman's touch in this masculine world of cattle and horses. Ethan knocked on the door, uncomfortable being this close to family life. He preferred the bunkhouse, where men respected the unspoken boundaries between past and present, where no one asked where you'd come from or why you'd left. The door opened to reveal a girl of perhaps 16, her curious eyes taking in the stranger on the porch. "I'm Ethan Irving. Mr. Peterson asked to see me." "Oh, yes, come in. Father is in his study." She stepped back, allowing him entry into a home far more elegant than Ethan had expected in this remote territory. Polished wood floors stretched beneath wool rugs in rich colors. The furniture, though sturdy and practical, showed craftsmanship beyond frontier necessity. Photographs and small ornaments spoke of a family with history and the means to preserve it. Ethan followed the girl down a hallway, acutely aware of his dusty boots and work-worn clothes. She knocked lightly on a door before opening it. "Father, Mr. Irving is here." James Peterson looked up from his desk, his weathered face creasing in a smile. Though in his 50s, he carried himself with the vigor of a much younger man. Success had not softened him, his hands bore the same calluses as any of his ranch hands. "Irving, come in, come in." "Thank you, Lily." He waved Ethan toward a chair as his daughter departed. "I understand you've got quite a way with horses." Ethan remained standing, hat in hand. "I just treat them with respect, sir." "Well, whatever you call it, I've got a proposition for you." Peterson leaned forward. "I'm sending a string of horses to Helena next week, quarter horses I've been breeding special. They're worth a small fortune to the right buyers. I need a man who can deliver them in prime condition." Ethan hesitated. "That's a long journey, sir, rough country. Which is why I'm willing to pay top dollar. Hank says you're the best horseman he's seen in years." Peterson named a sum that made Ethan's eyebrows rise slightly. "Plus expenses, of course." It was enough money to keep Ethan moving for months, maybe even put aside a small stake. The journey would be challenging but straightforward, the kind of honest work he preferred. "I'd need to stop in town first, get supplies," Ethan said, considering. "Naturally, take tomorrow. The horses won't be ready until the day after anyway." Peterson stood, extending his hand. "Do we have a deal, Irving?" Ethan shook the offered hand. "Yes, sir. I'll see those horses safely to Helena." "Excellent," Peterson clapped him on the shoulder. "You know, a man with your skills could find a permanent place here. I'm expanding the horse operation, need someone who understands breeding and training." The familiar tightness returned to Ethan's chest. "I appreciate that, Mr. Peterson, but I don't stay in one place too long." Something like understanding flickered in the older man's eyes. "Well, the offer stands. Sometimes a man finds reasons to put down roots when he least expects it." Ethan merely nodded, unwilling to explain that roots were precisely what he avoided. Roots meant attachment. Attachment meant vulnerability, and in Ethan's experience, vulnerability on the frontier was just another word for eventual heartbreak. "I'll head into town tomorrow, then," he said instead. "Get everything ready for an early start the following day." As Ethan walked back to the bunkhouse through the gathering twilight, he calculated how far the payment would take him. Perhaps north to Canada or west to the coast. Somewhere new where the land didn't remind him of all he'd lost. Somewhere he could continue the endless cycle of arrival and departure that had defined his adult life. It was safer that way, safer for everyone. Tessa moved through the mercantile with practiced efficiency, checking inventory and arranging new shipments. The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air as she worked. The familiar scent of coffee, leather, and fabric surrounded her, the smell of her childhood, of safety, of limitation. The store had been unusually busy with the news of Peterson's expanding ranch operations. New hands meant new business, and Tessa had spent the morning measuring coffee beans, weighing sugar, and counting out nails for men preparing to build additional corrals and bunkhouses. When the bell above the door jingled again, she suppressed a sigh before plastering on her professional smile. The expression froze as she took in the stranger who entered. He was not from Whiterock. She would have remembered him. Tall and lean, he carried himself with the easy grace of a man comfortable in his own skin. Dust from the trail lingered on his clothes, but he'd clearly made an effort to clean up before coming into town. His light brown hair curled slightly at the nape of his neck, and when he removed his hat, Tessa noticed his eyes, a clear blue that reminded her of mountain lakes. "Good morning," she said, finding her voice. "Welcome to Palmer's Mercantile. How may I help you?" The young man approached the counter, his expression carefully neutral. "Morning, miss. I need supplies for a journey to Helena, leaving tomorrow." Of course, Tessa reached for the order pad. "What will you need?" As he listed items, coffee, jerky, beans, ammunition, Tessa studied him from beneath her lashes. He wasn't much older than herself, perhaps 25, but something in his eyes spoke of experiences beyond his years. He had the weathered look of a man who lived outdoors, yet his features held a certain gentleness that contrasted with his rough exterior. "Will you be traveling alone, mister?" she inquired, pausing in her writing. "Irving." "Ethan Irving," he hesitated. "And yes, just me and 8 horses. Peterson hired me to deliver them to a buyer in Helena." 8 horses, that's quite an undertaking for one man, Tessa remarked, genuinely impressed. A flicker of something pride, perhaps, crossed his face before disappearing behind his composed expression. "I've managed bigger herds before." As Tessa gathered his supplies, moving gracefully between shelves and barrels, she felt his eyes following her. Not in the appraising way some men looked at her, but with a curious intensity that made her skin warm. "You're Richard Palmer's daughter?" he asked as she measured coffee beans into a paper sack. Tessa glanced up, surprised. "Yes." "How did you know?" "The old man at the hitching post, Jackson, mentioned it when I arrived in town." Ethan shifted his weight slightly. "Said your father runs the best mercantile in 3 counties. "Jackson talks too much," Tessa said with a small smile. "But Papa has built something special here. He came west after the war with nothing but determination." "That's quite an accomplishment," Ethan said, and something in his tone made Tessa look at him more closely. "Are you from around here, Mr. Irving?" His expression closed slightly. "No, I move around, go where the work is." Tessa tied the coffee sack with string, her fingers working nimbly. "That must be interesting, seeing different places, meeting new people." "It's just living, miss, nothing special about it." There was a finality to his tone that discouraged further questions, but it only piqued Tessa's curiosity. In a town where she knew everyone's history back 3 generations, this quiet stranger with guarded eyes was an enigma. "Will this be everything?" she asked, indicating the growing pile of supplies on the counter. Ethan nodded, then hesitated. "Actually, do you have any hard candy for the trail?" The request seemed incongruous with his otherwise practical list. Tessa smiled, reaching beneath the counter for a glass jar filled with colorful sweets. "Peppermint horehound or butterscotch?" A faint flush colored his cheeks. "A mix, if that's all right." As Tessa counted out the candies into a small paper bag, she noticed a scar across his right hand, old but significant. The mark of a life lived rough, yet he handled his hat with a certain gentleness that spoke of respect for the few possessions he owned. "That should do it," she said, totaling his purchases. "Shall I have these delivered to the livery?" "No need. I brought a pack horse." He counted out the money carefully, not wealthy, she noted, but not desperate either, just cautious with what he had. As she wrapped his purchases, their fingers brushed briefly. Tessa felt an unexpected spark of connection that made her look up sharply. Ethan's eyes met hers for a moment before he glanced away, as if the contact had disturbed him too. "Thank you, Miss Palmer." He gathered his supplies with efficient movements. "It's Tessa," she found herself saying. "Everyone calls me Tessa." He paused, hat already in hand. For a moment, something unguarded flickered in his expression, a loneliness that resonated with something inside her. "Tessa," he repeated quietly. Then with a slight nod he was gone, the bell jingling in his wake. Tessa remained at the counter, a strange restlessness stirring in her chest. In their brief interaction, she had sensed a depth to Ethan Irving that intrigued her, a story untold, wounds unhealed. It was foolish to be affected by a stranger passing through, yet she found herself hoping he might return before his journey to Helena. The bell jingled again as Mrs. Wilson entered, already talking about her son Thomas and his prospects, and Tessa forced her attention back to the present. Yet throughout the day, her thoughts continued to drift to the quiet cowboy with careful words and guarded eyes. The afternoon sun beat down on Whiterock's main street as Ethan secured the last of his supplies to the packhorse. He'd spent more than he'd intended at the mercantile, though the extra expense had little to do with necessity and everything to do with the golden-haired woman behind the counter. Tessa Palmer, the name lingered in his mind like a melody he couldn't quite shake. It wasn't just her beauty, though she was certainly beautiful with those emerald eyes and graceful movements. It was the intelligence behind her gaze, the way she'd looked at him as if truly seeing him, not just another drifting cowhand passing through. Dangerous thoughts for a man committed to the trail. Ethan tightened a strap with more force than necessary, earning a sidelong look from the packhorse. Just passing through, he reminded himself quietly, like always. Talking to yourself is the first sign of trouble, son. The livery owner, a barrel-chested man named Miller, approached with Ethan's saddle. Though out here, sometimes horses make better conversation than people. Ethan accepted the saddle with a nod of thanks. Just reminding myself of the route to Helena. Heard Peterson's sending you with those fancy quarter horses of his. Miller leaned against a post. That's quite a vote of confidence for a newcomer. Ethan shrugged, uncomfortable with the implied praise. Just a job. 8 valuable horses through mountain country ain't just a job. Peterson must see something in you. Miller studied him with shrewd eyes. You ever consider staying in one place? Man with your skills could build something here. The familiar pressure squeezed Ethan's chest. Not my way. Miller nodded, seeming to understand the unspoken. Well, if you change your mind, Whiterock's growing. Good place for a man to put down roots. Before Ethan could respond, a commotion erupted further down the street. Shouts and the sound of breaking glass carried on the hot afternoon air. Without thinking, Ethan moved toward the disturbance, Miller close behind. A crowd had gathered outside the saloon where 2 men were locked in a vicious brawl. One, a ranch hand Ethan recognized from Peterson's place, was clearly outmatched by his opponent, a burly man with a wild beard and eyes glazed with drink. That's Granger, Miller muttered. Bad news, been causing trouble since he drifted in last week. As they watched, Granger landed a powerful blow that sent the ranch hand sprawling into the dust. Instead of ending the fight, Granger advanced, boot raised to deliver a kick that could cause serious damage. Ethan moved without conscious thought, stepping between them and catching Granger's boot mid-swing. With a twist of his wrist, he sent the larger man stumbling backward. That's enough, Ethan said, his voice low but carrying the unmistakable edge of warning. Granger regained his balance, rage contorting his features. Who the hell are you to interfere? Nobody, Ethan replied evenly. Just someone who thinks a fight ends when a man goes down. Well, nobody, I say, when a fight ends. Granger lunged forward, a wicked-looking knife suddenly appearing in his hand. Ethan sidestepped the clumsy attack, using Granger's momentum against him. With practiced movements, he disarmed the larger man and twisted his arm behind his back, forcing him to his knees in the street dust. Drop the knife, Ethan said quietly. When Granger hesitated, Ethan increased the pressure slightly. I won't ask again. The knife fell to the dirt with a dull thud. Only then did Ethan become aware of the silent crowd watching, and among them, standing in the doorway of the mercantile, Tessa Palmer, her eyes wide with concern. The sheriff pushed through the onlookers, a weathered man with a silver star pinned to his vest. What's happening here? Miller stepped forward. Granger started a fight, pulled a knife when he was losing. Irving here stepped in before anyone got killed. The sheriff assessed the situation with experienced eyes. That right, Irving. Ethan nodded, still holding Granger immobile. Yes, sir. All right, let him go. I'll take it from here. Ethan released his hold and stepped back, watching as the sheriff hauled Granger to his feet. The man glared at Ethan with undisguised hatred. This ain't over, Granger snarled as the sheriff led him away. The crowd began to disperse, several men stopping to clap Ethan on the shoulder in silent approval. The ranch hand he'd protected, Jimmy, Ethan recalled, approached with a grateful nod. Thanks, Irving. Didn't see the knife till it was too late. No trouble, Ethan replied, uncomfortable with the attention. As the street cleared, Ethan became aware of Tessa approaching, a cloth in her hands. Only then did he notice the blood trickling from a cut on his forearm. Granger's knife must have caught him during the scuffle. "You're hurt," she said, her voice tinged with concern. "It's nothing." The cut stung, but Ethan had suffered far worse. Tessa's expression brooked no argument. "It needs cleaning. Come inside before it festers." Something in her tone, a quiet authority that reminded him of his mother, made Ethan comply. He followed her into the mercantile, acutely aware of the curious glances from townspeople still lingering on the street. Inside, Tessa led him to a small back room furnished with a table and chairs. Shelves lined the walls, neatly stocked with inventory. She gestured for him to sit, then poured water from a pitcher into a basin. "Remove your shirt," she instructed, her tone professional despite the faint color that rose to her cheeks. Ethan hesitated, then complied, wincing slightly as the fabric pulled at the drying blood. The cut ran along his forearm, not deep but long enough to be troublesome. Tessa worked with practiced efficiency, cleaning the wound with gentle but thorough movements. Her closeness was discomfiting. Ethan couldn't remember the last time anyone had tended to him with such care. "That was brave," she said quietly as she worked. "Foolish, perhaps, but brave." Ethan shrugged his uninjured shoulder. Just didn't want to see a man kicked when he was down. "Is that why you're taking 8 horses to Helena alone?" "Because you don't like uneven odds." There was a teasing note in her voice that drew Ethan's gaze to her face. Up close, he could see the light dusting of freckles across her nose, nearly invisible against her sun-kissed skin. Her golden hair was pulled back in a practical style, but wisps had escaped to frame her face. She was, he realized with an uncomfortable jolt, even more beautiful than he'd first thought. "The horses are just business," he said, looking away. Tessa applied a salve that smelled of herbs to his cut, then began bandaging it with clean cloth. "Papa says a man reveals his true character not through his words, but through his actions when he believes no one is watching." Her fingers brushed his skin as she secured the bandage. "You didn't hesitate to help Jimmy. Your father sounds like a wise man." "He is." Tessa finished her work and stepped back. "Though he would probably say I shouldn't be alone in a storeroom with a man I barely know." There was a hint of mischief in her eyes that caught Ethan off guard. This proper merchant's daughter had depths he hadn't expected. "Thank you for tending to this," he said, reaching for his shirt. "I should get back to my preparations." Tessa watched him, her head tilted slightly. "Will you return to Whiterock after Helena?" The question carried more weight than its simple words suggested. Ethan paused, shirt half-buttoned. "I doubt it," he answered honestly. "The trail usually leads forward, not back." Something like disappointment flickered across her face before she masked it with a polite smile. "Well then, Mr. Irving, I wish you safe travels." As Ethan stepped back onto the street, the afternoon sun warming his shoulders, he felt a strange reluctance to leave the mercantile, to leave her presence. It was an unfamiliar sensation for a man who had spent years perfecting the art of departure. Back at the livery, he finished his preparations mechanically, his mind elsewhere. The smart thing would be to ride out now, camp on the trail, and get an early start tomorrow. Put distance between himself and green eyes that saw too much. Instead, Ethan found himself accepting Miller's offer of a spare room above the livery for the night. One last night in Whiterock before the journey to Helena. One more chance to see the mercantile and its golden-haired proprietress before returning to the solitary life he'd chosen. It was a foolish indulgence, and Ethan knew it. Nothing good came from lingering, from connections, from the dangerous warmth that had sparked in his chest when Tessa Palmer had tended his wound with gentle hands. Yet as dusk fell over Whiterock, Ethan found himself standing outside the mercantile, watching as lamps were lit inside, casting a golden glow through the windows. He didn't go in, just stood in the gathering darkness, memorizing the sight to take with him on the lonely trail ahead. Tessa closed the ledger with a sigh, her mind still replaying the afternoon's events. The sight of Ethan Irving stepping between 2 fighting men, his movements controlled and precise, had stirred something within her, admiration mixed with a strange, fluttering anxiety. When she'd seen the blood on his arm, her instinct to help had overridden propriety. Only afterward, as she'd bandaged his wound in the storeroom, had she realized how improper it was to be alone with him, to touch his bare skin, to feel the warmth radiating from his lean frame. The memory made her cheeks warm even now, hours later. There had been something in his eyes when he looked at her, a guarded loneliness that called to her own restless spirit. "You're distracted tonight," her father observed as they sat down to supper. "Is something troubling you?" Tessa arranged her napkin in her lap, buying time to compose her thoughts. "I was just thinking about the fight today. It could have ended badly if Mr. Irving hadn't intervened." "Yes, I heard about that." Richard cut into his roast beef with precise movements, quite remarkable for a stranger to involve himself in town matters. "He didn't hesitate," Tessa said, unable to keep the admiration from her voice. "Even when Granger pulled a knife." Her father studied her with knowing eyes. "This Irving fellow, he's the one taking Peterson's horses to Helena." "Yes, he's leaving tomorrow." Richard took a sip of water. "Thomas Wilson asked after you today. He's planning to expand his father's freight business to include a regular route to Helena. Quite enterprising." Tessa recognized her father's attempt to steer the conversation toward more appropriate subjects. Thomas Wilson represented everything practical and secure, a future of comfort and respectability within the familiar confines of Whiterock. "That's nice," she replied noncommittally. "Did Mrs. Jameson decide on the fabric for the wedding dress?" The conversation turned to safer topics, but Tessa's thoughts continually drifted back to Ethan Irving. What drove a man to wander without roots? What shadows lurked behind those guarded blue eyes? And why did his imminent departure leave her with such a profound sense of missed opportunity? After supper, Tessa stepped onto the porch for a breath of evening air. The street was quiet now, most of Whiterock's residents settled in for the night. Lanterns glowed in windows, and somewhere a piano played a melancholy tune. Movement across the street caught her eye, a tall figure emerging from the shadows near the livery. Even in the dim light, she recognized Ethan's distinctive silhouette. He stood motionless for a long moment, looking toward the mercantile before turning and walking away. Had he been watching for her? The thought sent an unexpected thrill through her veins, followed immediately by a chiding voice that sounded remarkably like her father's. What did it matter? He would be gone tomorrow, another drifter passing through Whiterock, leaving nothing behind but stories of a brief act of courage. Yet as Tessa returned inside, she found herself hoping that morning might come slowly for once. Dawn broke clear and cool over Whiterock as Ethan led his string of horses from the livery. Peterson's prized quarter horses were magnificent animals, muscular, intelligent, and worth a small fortune to the right buyer. Ethan had spent the early hours checking tack and securing his supplies, eager to be on the trail before the town fully awoke. The journey to Helena would take at least 5 days if all went well, longer if weather or other complications slowed his progress. It was straightforward work, the kind Ethan preferred. Just him, the horses, and the vast Montana landscape, with no expectations beyond delivering his charges safely to their destination. As he rode past the shuttered mercantile, Ethan told himself the hollow feeling in his chest was just hunger, not disappointment at leaving without seeing Tessa again. It was better this way, cleaner. No awkward farewells, no lingering glances to carry with him. Just another town falling behind him as the trail stretched forward. He had nearly reached the edge of town when he heard hoofbeats approaching from behind. Turning in the saddle, he was surprised to see Tessa herself riding toward him, her golden hair loose around her shoulders in the morning light. She wore a practical riding skirt and jacket, but even in the simple attire, she carried herself with an innate grace that caught his breath. "Mr. Irving," she called, bringing her horse alongside his. "I was afraid I'd missed you." Ethan reined Storm to a halt, the string of horses stopping obediently behind him. "Miss Palmer." "You're up early." "Tessa," she corrected with a smile that warmed her entire face. "And yes, Papa thinks I'm checking inventory before opening." She held out a small package wrapped in brown paper. "For your journey. Just some biscuits and jerky, and a few of those candies you seem to like." The unexpected kindness left Ethan momentarily speechless. He accepted the package, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. "Thank you," he said finally. "This is very thoughtful." Tessa studied him with those remarkable green eyes, as if memorizing his features. "Will you truly not return to Whiterock after Helena?" The question hung between them in the cool morning air. Ethan knew the sensible answer, the only answer that aligned with the life he'd chosen. Yet looking at her, golden in the dawn light, he found himself hesitating. "I hadn't planned to," he said honestly. "Plans can change," she replied, a hint of challenge in her voice. Before Ethan could respond, a commotion erupted behind them, shouts and the pounding of hooves. A rider galloped toward them, his face tight with urgency. Ethan recognized Jimmy, the ranch hand he'd helped during yesterday's fight. "Irving," Jimmy called, pulling his lathered horse to a stop. "Thank God I caught you. There's trouble at the ranch." Ethan tensed, instinctively placing himself between Tessa and the agitated man. "What happened?" "Rustlers hit during the night," Jimmy panted. "Took 20 head of Peterson's best breeding stock. The boss is organizing a posse to go after them, but he needs someone who can track." He cast an apologetic glance at the string of quarter horses. "He says Helena will have to wait." A familiar coldness settled in Ethan's chest. Cattle rustling was a hanging offense in these parts, and posses were notoriously quick to dispense frontier justice. Yet Peterson had been fair to him, and those cattle represented years of careful breeding. "How long ago?" Ethan asked, already calculating. 3, maybe 4 hours. They headed northwest toward the pass. Ethan nodded, decision made. "Tell Peterson I'll meet the posse at the North Fork. I'll start tracking from there." He turned to Tessa, whose face had paled at the news. "I need to leave these horses somewhere secure." "The livery," she said immediately. "I'll explain to Mr. Miller." "Thank you," Ethan hesitated, then added, "It seems I may be in Whiterock longer than I expected." A complicated mix of emotions crossed Tessa's face, concern, relief, and something deeper that Ethan dared not name. "Be careful," she said softly. "Rustlers are desperate men." As Jimmy galloped back toward the ranch, Ethan and Tessa returned to town in silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. At the livery, Miller agreed to board the quarter horses until Ethan returned. "I should be back in a few days," Ethan said as he transferred his gear to Storm and selected a rifle from his supplies. "A week at most." Tessa stood nearby, her hands clasped tightly before her. "Mr. Irving, Ethan, please take care. Those mountains are treacherous, even without men who wouldn't hesitate to shoot a pursuer." The sound of his given name on her lips sent an unexpected warmth through him. "I've been in worse situations," he assured her, checking his ammunition, "and I won't be alone." Yet as he mounted Storm, preparing to ride out, Ethan realized that returning to Whiterock had suddenly taken on new significance. It was no longer just a place to pass through, but somewhere, someone to come back to. The revelation was as unsettling as it was exhilarating. For 13 years, he'd avoided connections, protected himself from the pain of loss by refusing to put down even the shallowest roots. Now, in the space of 2 days, a woman with golden hair and eyes that saw too much had somehow slipped past his defenses. "I'll return," he said, meeting her gaze directly. It was both promise and admission of what he wasn't entirely sure. Tessa nodded, her expression solemn. "I'll hold you to that, Ethan Irving." As he rode out of Whiterock, following the trail toward the North Fork, Ethan carried with him more than supplies and weapons. He carried the weight of a promise made to green eyes and a gentle smile, a promise that, for the first time in years, made him look forward to returning rather than leaving. The next 3 days passed with excruciating slowness for Tessa. Each hour stretched endlessly as she went through the motions of her daily routine, opening the store, serving customers, keeping inventory, closing at dusk. All while her thoughts remained with the posse tracking rustlers through dangerous mountain terrain. News trickled back to town in fragments. The rustlers were a notorious gang from over the state line. They were heavily armed. They had split up, making tracking more difficult. With each report, Tessa's anxiety grew, though she took pains to conceal it from her father. On the evening of the 3rd day, Tessa sat on the porch, watching the street for any sign of returning riders. The spring air carried the scent of lilacs from Mrs. Henderson's garden down the way, but even their sweet fragrance couldn't soothe her restless spirit. "You've taken quite an interest in this rustler business," her father remarked, settling into the chair beside her. "Or is it the posse you're watching for?" Tessa glanced at him, startled by his perception. "I'm just concerned, Papa, so many of our neighbors are involved." Richard studied her with knowing eyes, including a certain cowboy who's not really a neighbor at all. Heat rose to Tessa's cheeks. Mr. Irving showed great courage in town. It's natural to be concerned for his safety. Is it just his courage that interests you, Tessa? Her father's voice held no accusation, only gentle inquiry. I've seen how your eyes light up whenever his name is mentioned. Tessa looked down at her hands, unsure how to respond. How could she explain feelings she herself barely understood? The connection she'd felt to Ethan from their first meeting, the sense that beneath his guarded exterior lay depths that matched her own unexplored longing. He's different, Papa, she said finally. Not like the boys I grew up with or the men who come courting with one eye on me and the other on your store. Richard sighed, reaching over to cover her hand with his. Tessa, I want your happiness more than anything, but a drifting cowhand with no roots, that's a precarious foundation for any kind of future. I know, Tessa turned to face her father fully. But don't you ever wonder if there's more to life than what's safe and sensible? Don't you ever wish you'd taken more chances? A shadow crossed Richard's face, a glimpse of old pain she rarely saw. When your mother died, I wondered if loving her had been worth the agony of losing her. He squeezed Tessa's hand. It was, every moment, but that doesn't mean I don't worry about you facing similar pain. Before Tessa could respond, commotion erupted at the far end of the street. Riders were approaching, weary men on dust-covered horses, the posse returning. Tessa rose, straining to make out individual figures in the gathering dusk. Her heart raced as she searched for Ethan's distinctive silhouette among the riders. Go, her father said softly. Just remember that actions have consequences, Tessa, for both heart and reputation. With a grateful glance at her father, Tessa hurried down the steps and into the street, joining the small crowd gathering to meet the returning men. Sheriff Harding led the group, his weathered face grim beneath his dust-covered hat. Behind him rode Peterson and several ranch hands, including Jimmy. They looked exhausted but triumphant, and then at the rear, Tessa spotted Ethan. He rode slightly apart from the others, leading a packhorse laden with what appeared to be recovered items. Even at a distance, Tessa could see that his clothes were torn and dirt-streaked, his posture betraying exhaustion despite his straight-backed seat in the saddle. Relief washed over her with such intensity that her knees felt momentarily weak. He was alive. Injured perhaps, there appeared to be a crude bandage around his left thigh, but alive. As the riders reached the center of town, townspeople pressed forward with questions. Sheriff Harding raised a hand for silence. The rustlers have been dealt with, he announced, his voice carrying across the crowd. 4 in custody, 2 dead. We recovered all but 3 head of cattle. They'll be returned to Peterson's ranch tomorrow. A cheer went up from the gathered townspeople. Peterson dismounted, accepting handshakes and congratulations with weary dignity. Couldn't have done it without Irving here, he said, gesturing toward Ethan. Best tracker I've seen in 20 years, followed sign I couldn't even see. All eyes turned to Ethan, who received the attention with obvious discomfort. His gaze swept the crowd until it found Tessa, and for a brief moment their eyes locked across the distance. Something passed between them, recognition, relief, an unspoken acknowledgement of the promise kept. Then someone slapped Ethan on the shoulder, breaking the connection. The crowd swarmed around the returning heroes, and Tessa lost sight of him in the commotion. It was nearly an hour later when Tessa, having returned to help her father close the store, heard a knock at the back door. Her heart quickened as she crossed to open it, somehow knowing who she would find. Ethan stood in the shadows of the alley, his hat in his hands. Up close, he looked even more battered than she'd first thought. A bruise darkened his jaw, and exhaustion lined his face. Yet his eyes, when they met hers, held a warmth that belied his ragged appearance. You're hurt, Tessa said, echoing their exchange from days before. A faint smile touched his lips. Nothing serious. Come inside. Let me help you. She stepped back, holding the door wider. Ethan hesitated, glancing toward the main street where celebrations continued. It's late, your father is upstairs, Tessa finished, and would not turn away an injured man who helped save our neighbor's livelihood. After another moment's hesitation, Ethan stepped inside, bringing with him the scents of dust, pine, and something uniquely his own. Tessa led him to the same back room where she'd tended his arm days earlier, lighting a lamp that cast a warm glow over the small space. Sit, she instructed, pointing to a chair. Let me see that leg. Ethan complied, moving with the careful precision of someone managing pain. It's just a graze. One of the rustlers got lucky. A bullet wound is never just anything, Tessa replied, gathering clean cloths and her father's bottle of whiskey. Did someone tend to it properly? Peterson's wife cleaned it as best she could before we rode back. He watched as Tessa dampened a cloth. You seem experienced with this sort of thing. I've helped Doc Walsh since I was 16, she explained, kneeling beside his chair. With so few women in the territory, he needed someone with smaller hands for delicate work. Ethan's eyebrows rose slightly. A nurse as well as a shopkeeper, you're full of surprises, Tessa Palmer. The use of her given name sent a pleasant warmth through her veins. May I? She asked, gesturing to his injured leg. At his nod, Tessa carefully rolled up his pant leg to reveal a crude bandage above his knee. Blood had seeped through, but not recently. With gentle fingers, she unwrapped the cloth, revealing an angry red furrow across his thigh. This needs proper cleaning and stitching, she said, professional concern overriding her awareness of the intimacy of their position. The doctor. No, Ethan interrupted. No, doctor, it's not that bad. Tessa looked up at him, understanding dawning. You don't want questions about old scars. Something flickered in his eyes, surprise at her perception, perhaps. Let's just say I prefer privacy. I can stitch it, Tessa offered, but it will hurt without laudanum. I've had worse without complaint. There was no bravado in his statement, just simple truth, and Tessa felt a pang at the life that had taught him such stoicism. With efficient movements, she cleaned the wound, using the whiskey as disinfectant. Ethan inhaled sharply but made no other sound, his hands gripping the chair arms as she worked. The rustlers, she asked, partly to distract him as she prepared needle and thread. Professional thieves, Ethan replied, his voice steady despite the pain she knew he must be feeling. They've been working this territory for months. We tracked them to a canyon near the state line. Sheriff Harding said 2 were killed. Ethan's expression darkened. They chose to fight rather than surrender. One of them nearly shot Jimmy, would have if I hadn't been quicker. The implication hung in the air between them. Ethan had taken a life, perhaps not for the first time. Tessa paused in her preparations, meeting his gaze directly. You saved Jimmy's life, again. This time it cost more, he looked away. I don't take pleasure in violence, Tessa. I know, she touched his hand briefly. I can see that in you. As she began stitching the wound, working with the practiced precision Doc Walsh had taught her, Tessa sensed Ethan watching her. His silence held a weight of unasked questions and unspoken thoughts. Why did you come back here tonight? She asked quietly, not looking up from her work. You could have gone to the doctor tomorrow. Ethan was silent for so long that Tessa thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and hesitant. I made a promise to return, another pause, and I wanted to see you, to let you know I was all right. The simple honesty of his words stopped her hands momentarily. Why? I don't know, he admitted. I've spent years never looking back, never caring if anyone worried about where I was, but with you. He trailed off, seemingly unable to articulate the thought. Tessa resumed her stitching, her heart beating a rapid rhythm against her ribs. I did worry, she confessed, more than was sensible for someone I barely know. A faint smile touched his lips. I'm not sure sensible decisions are either of our strong suits at the moment. Tessa tied off the last stitch and cut the thread. There, it will scar, but it should heal cleanly if you keep it clean. She began bandaging the wound with fresh cloth, her fingers working nimbly despite her awareness of his proximity. Thank you, Ethan's voice was rough with fatigue and something deeper. Not just for this, but for, he gestured vaguely, for caring if I came back. Tessa secured the bandage and sat back on her heels, looking up at him in the warm lamplight. In this moment, with his defenses lowered by exhaustion and pain, she could see beyond the guarded exterior to the man beneath. A man who carried old wounds far deeper than the one she'd just stitched. Will you tell me someday, she asked softly, about what made you choose a life of constant movement? The question hung between them, intimate, presumptuous, implying a future connection beyond this moment. Ethan's expression shifted, vulnerability giving way to his habitual caution. It's not a pleasant story, he said finally. Few true stories are, Tessa replied, rising to her feet. But they're still worth hearing. From upstairs came the sound of movement, her father preparing for bed. Ethan noticed it too, straightening in his chair. I should go, it's late, and you've done more than enough. Tessa knew he was right, propriety demanded it, yet she was reluctant to see him leave. What will you do now? The horses to Helena. Peterson wants me to wait until my leg heals before attempting the journey, Ethan said, rolling down his pant leg carefully. A week, perhaps longer. So you'll be staying in Whiterock. Tessa couldn't keep the pleasure from her voice. Ethan's gaze met hers, serious and searching. Yes, though it might be wiser if I didn't. The warning was clear to both of them. Whatever was growing between them could only lead to complication, perhaps pain. Ethan would leave eventually. It was the nature of his chosen life. And Tessa belonged to Whiterock, to the store, to the future her father envisioned for her. Yet as she walked him to the door, neither spoke these obvious truths. Instead, they lingered in the doorway, reluctant to break the fragile connection forged in lamplight and honest words. "Good night, Tessa Palmer," Ethan said finally, placing his hat on his head. "Thank you for your care." "Good night, Ethan Irving," she replied softly. "I'm glad you came back." As she watched him disappear into the night, Tessa knew with sudden clarity that her life had reached a crossroads. The safe path lay in forgetting this strange connection, in turning her attention back to suitable prospects like Thomas Wilson. The other path, the one that beckoned with terrifying allure, led toward a man who carried shadows in his eyes and scars on his body, who offered no promises of permanence or security. For the first time in her life, Tessa found herself contemplating the riskier path with something like longing. The week that followed took on a dreamlike quality for Ethan. Each day he divided his time between helping at Peterson's ranch, light work while his leg healed, and finding reasons to visit town. Each evening found him on the porch of the boarding house where he'd taken a room, watching the streets of Whiterock with new eyes. It was a pleasant town, he realized, not just a place to pass through, but a community with rhythms and relationships that spoke of permanence. Children played in the dusty streets, women gathered on porches to share news and needlework. Men nodded to each other with the easy familiarity of shared history. And at the center of it all was Palmer's Mercantile, where Tessa worked alongside her father with graceful efficiency. Ethan found himself stopping by almost daily, for supplies he didn't need, for conversation that lingered longer each time, for moments when their fingers might brush as she handed him his purchases. It was dangerous, this growing connection. Ethan knew it, yet couldn't seem to pull away. Something about Tessa Palmer had slipped past his carefully constructed defenses, her quiet strength, her unexpected humor, the way she looked at him as though seeing something worthwhile where he had long believed there was nothing of value. On the 5th day after his return, Ethan entered the Mercantile to find not Tessa but her father behind the counter. Richard Palmer looked up from his ledger, his expression guarded but not unwelcoming. "Mr. Irving. What can I help you with today?" Ethan removed his hat, suddenly feeling like an awkward boy rather than a man of 25 who had faced down rustlers and survived wilderness winters alone. "Good afternoon, Mr. Palmer. I was hoping to purchase some writing paper and ink." Richard raised an eyebrow as he reached for the requested items. "Planning to write letters? I wasn't aware you had people to correspond with." The gentle probe was expertly delivered, a father's way of gathering information about the man spending increasingly more time with his daughter. "Just some business matters to attend to," Ethan replied, unwilling to admit that he'd never written a personal letter in his life. Who would he write to? He had no family, no permanent address where responses might find him. Richard wrapped the paper and ink carefully. "My daughter mentioned you'll be taking Peterson's horses to Helena soon." "Yes, sir, once the leg's fully healed." And after that, the older man's gaze was direct, his meaning clear. Ethan met his eyes, knowing he owed this man honesty. "I haven't decided, sir." Richard placed the package on the counter. "Mr. Irving, you strike me as a decent man, so I'll speak plainly. My daughter has taken an interest in you. I've raised her alone since she was 8 years old, done my best to prepare her for a secure future." He leaned forward slightly. "A drifting cowboy with uncertain prospects doesn't figure into that future." The words stung, though Ethan couldn't deny their truth. "I understand your concern, Mr. Palmer." "Do you?" "Because Tessa is young, and despite her practical nature, she has her mother's romantic heart." Richard's expression softened slightly. "I don't want to see her hurt when you inevitably move on." The statement hung between them, a challenge and a prophecy. Ethan felt the familiar urge to retreat, to protect himself from involvement, from expectations he couldn't fulfill. It would be simpler to agree, to promise to keep his distance from Tessa, to return to the solitary existence he'd crafted for himself. Yet when he spoke, the words surprised him. With respect, Mr. Palmer, I believe Tessa deserves to make her own choices, as do I. Ethan placed money on the counter for his purchase. I can't offer promises about the future. But I can assure you that I would never deliberately cause her pain. Richard studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Fair enough, Mr. Irving. Just remember that intentions don't always prevent consequences. As Ethan left the mercantile, package in hand, he was unsettled by the encounter. Richard Palmer's concerns echoed his own misgivings. What could he offer Tessa but temporary company and eventual departure? She deserved more, a man with roots, with prospects, with a future to share. Yet as he walked back toward the livery, another thought nagged at him. For 13 years he defined himself by what he didn't have, no home, no family, no permanent ties. What if there was another way to measure a man's worth? What if having nothing to offer wasn't the same as being nothing? The questions followed him throughout the day, lingering as he worked with Peterson's horses, as he ate his solitary supper, as he sat on the boarding house porch watching twilight settle over Whiterock. It was there that Tessa found him, her approach heralded by the soft rustle of her skirts against the boardwalk. She wore a simple blue dress, her golden hair partially pinned up but with strands escaping to frame her face. In the fading light, she looked both ethereal and utterly real, a vision that somehow belonged in this frontier town yet seemed too precious for its rough edges. "Good evening, Mr. Irving," she said, her formal address belied by the warmth in her voice. Ethan rose, hat in hand. "Miss Palmer, this is a pleasant surprise." "I'm on my way to the Hendersons for dinner," she explained, gesturing vaguely down the street. "I saw you sitting here alone and thought I'd say hello." "I'm glad you did." He hesitated, then asked, "Would you like to sit for a moment?" Tessa glanced toward her destination, then nodded. "Just for a minute, Mrs. Henderson won't mind if I'm a little late." As she settled beside him on the porch swing, Ethan was acutely aware of her nearness, of the faint scent of lavender that clung to her hair, of the proper distance between them that somehow felt both too great and not great enough. "I missed you at the store today," she said, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "I spoke with your father," Ethan replied, choosing honesty over pretense. "He has concerns about my intentions toward you." A faint blush colored Tessa's cheeks, but she met his gaze steadily. "And what are your intentions, Ethan?" The directness of her question caught him off guard. In that moment, looking into her clear green eyes, Ethan wished he had a simple answer, wished he could be the kind of man who could speak of courtship and future and forever without reservation. "I don't know," he admitted finally. "I've spent years avoiding connections, Tessa." "It's safer that way." "Safer for whom?" The gentle challenge in her voice made him look away. "For everyone." Tessa was silent for a moment, the porch swing creaking softly as she set it in motion with one foot. "When I was 12, she said finally, I found my mother's journal. She wrote about coming west with my father, about how terrified she was to leave everything familiar behind." She turned to face him more fully. "But she also wrote that a life without risk wasn't really living at all, it was just existing." The words struck a chord deep within Ethan, resonating with something long buried. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." "She was," Tessa's voice softened with memory. "Papa has tried to protect me since her death. I understand his caution, but sometimes I think he's forgotten what she taught us both, that safety isn't the same as happiness." In the gathering dusk, with the sounds of Whiterock settling into evening around them, Ethan felt a strange clarity descend. Here was a woman of substance and spirit, offering not demands but understanding, not expectations but possibility. "I'm leaving for Helena in 3 days," he said quietly. "Peterson says the horses are ready, and my leg is healed enough for the journey." "I know," Tessa's gaze remained steady on his face. "Will you come back afterward?" The question hung between them, weighted with unspoken meaning. Ethan knew what his usual answer would be, a noncommittal shrug, perhaps a vague perhaps that both knew meant no. The trail always led forward, not back. That had been his creed for 13 years. Yet looking at Tessa in the soft evening light, he found himself unwilling to offer those familiar evasions. Would you want me to? He asked instead. Yes, she answered simply, without hesitation or artifice. I would. The honesty of her response deserved equal honesty in return. Ethan took a deep breath. Then I'll return. I can't promise what happens after that, Tessa. I don't know myself, but I'll come back to Whiterock. The smile that illuminated her face made something tight in his chest loosen slightly. For the first time in years, Ethan had made a promise that had nothing to do with work or survival, a promise based solely on human connection. I should go, Tessa said, rising reluctantly. Mrs. Henderson will send out a search party soon. Ethan stood as well, suddenly unwilling to let the moment end. May I walk you there? I'd like that. As they walked side by side down Whiterock's main street, not touching but close enough to feel each other's presence, Ethan was struck by how natural it felt. How right, despite all the reasons it shouldn't be. At the Hendersons' gate they paused. The house beyond was warmly lit, voices and laughter spilling from open windows into the cool evening air. Goodbye, Ethan, Tessa said softly. Be safe on your journey. Goodbye, Tessa, he hesitated, then added, I'll be back in 2 weeks, maybe less if the weather holds. She nodded, her eyes reflecting the porch lamps behind him. I'll be here. As Ethan walked back to the boarding house, his steps lighter than they had been in years, he realized something had fundamentally shifted within him. For the first time since his parents' deaths, he was looking forward to returning somewhere, to seeing someone again. The sensation was as terrifying as it was exhilarating. He still had nothing tangible to offer, no land, no home, no fortune. But for the first time, he wondered if perhaps that wasn't the full measure of a man's worth after all. The journey to Helena unfolded without incident, which Ethan found almost disappointing. Perfect weather, cooperative horses, and clear trails left him too much time to think about Whiterock, about Tessa, about possibilities he'd never before allowed himself to consider. As he delivered the horses to their new owner, a wealthy rancher expanding his breeding program, Ethan found himself conducting business with unexpected confidence. The final payment exceeded Peterson's expectations, a testament to the prime condition of the animals after their journey. You've got away with horses, Irving, the Helena rancher remarked as he counted out the money. I could use a man with your skills on a permanent basis. 2 weeks earlier, Ethan might have considered the offer. Good pay, respectable work, a new place where his past couldn't find him. Instead, he found himself politely declining, explaining that he had commitments back in Whiterock. Commitments. The word felt foreign on his tongue. For 13 years, he'd avoided commitments of any kind, valuing his freedom above all else. Yet now he found himself purchasing small gifts to bring back, a leather-bound journal for Tessa, candies for the Peterson children, even a bottle of fine whiskey for Richard Palmer, though he wasn't sure the merchant would accept it. As Ethan rode back toward Whiterock, Storm beneath him and the packhorse trailing behind, he felt an unfamiliar anticipation building with each passing mile. Not the usual relief of movement, of leaving responsibilities behind, but a new sensation, the pull of return, of connection, of something that felt dangerously like belonging. The final ridge before Whiterock came into view on a perfect spring afternoon. Ethan reined Storm to a halt, taking in the panorama below. The town looked smaller from this distance, vulnerable against the vast landscape that surrounded it. Yet it persisted, a collection of human hopes and dreams carved into the wilderness. What do you think, Storm? He murmured to the horse. Could a man find peace in a place like that? Storm snorted, as if to say the question was Ethan's to answer, not his. With a rueful smile, Ethan urged the horse forward, descending the trail toward Whiterock and whatever awaited him there. The town was quiet as he rode down the main street, most people indoors at this hour seeking relief from the afternoon heat. Ethan made his way first to the Peterson ranch, where he was greeted with enthusiasm by James Peterson. Irving, right on time and successful too, by the looks of it. The rancher clapped him on the shoulder as Ethan dismounted. Come inside and tell me how it went. Over coffee in Peterson's study, Ethan provided a detailed account of the journey and transaction. Peterson's satisfaction grew as Ethan counted out the payment, significantly more than the asking price. Harding said you were worth twice what I was paying you, and he was right, Peterson declared, pushing a generous portion of the money back toward Ethan. That's your share, well earned. The sum was substantial, more money than Ethan had possessed at one time in years. Enough to travel anywhere he wished to start fresh yet again in some new territory, or enough for something else entirely. "Mr. Peterson," Ethan said carefully, "I've been thinking about your offer. About a permanent position here." Peterson's eyebrows rose slightly. "Have you now, what's changed your mind?" Ethan hesitated, unwilling to speak Tessa's name aloud in this context. "Let's just say I'm considering new possibilities." A knowing smile spread across Peterson's face. "Would these possibilities have anything to do with Richard Palmer's daughter? Town's been talking, you know." Heat rose to Ethan's face. "The town should mind its own business." Peterson laughed. "This is a small community, Irving. Everyone's business is everyone's business." His expression grew more serious. "But if you're looking to settle, I meant what I said. I need someone to develop the horse breeding program. The position comes with use of the line cabin by the creek. It's small but solid. Could be expanded for a family if it came to that." The offer was more generous than Ethan had expected, not just employment but the beginnings of a true place in the community. Yet something held him back from immediate acceptance. "I appreciate that, Mr. Peterson. I'd like some time to consider it properly." Of course," Peterson rose, extending his hand. "The offer stands. In the meantime, why don't you get cleaned up and head into town? I imagine there's someone who'll be happy to see you've returned safely." As Ethan rode toward Whiterock an hour later, freshly bathed and wearing his cleanest clothes, the weight of Peterson's offer and his own unfamiliar yearnings pressed upon him. The journal he'd purchased for Tessa was carefully wrapped and stored in his saddlebag, a token more meaningful than he wanted to admit. The mercantile's windows reflected the late afternoon sun as Ethan approached. Through the glass he could see Tessa assisting a customer, her golden head bent attentively as she wrapped a purchase. The sight of her after 2 weeks' absence affected him more strongly than he'd anticipated, a tightness in his chest, a quickening of his pulse. "This is dangerous," a voice within him cautioned. "This feeling is how people get hurt." Yet he dismounted anyway, securing Storm to the hitching post before removing his hat and entering the store. The bell above the door announced his arrival, and Tessa looked up, her expression transforming from polite attention to radiant joy when she saw him. "Ethan, you're back," she caught herself, glancing toward her customer, Mrs. Wilson, Ethan noted, whose son Thomas was apparently still interested in courting Tessa. "Excuse me, Mrs. Wilson, will there be anything else today?" The older woman looked between them with poorly concealed interest. "No, dear, that's all. Please give my regards to your father." She gathered her purchases, nodding politely to Ethan as she departed. When the door closed behind her, Tessa moved from behind the counter, stopping just short of embracing Ethan, a gesture he realized with surprise that he would have welcomed. "You're earlier than expected," she said, her eyes taking in his appearance as if confirming he was truly there and unharmed. "Was the journey successful?" "Very," Ethan found himself smiling, the expression coming more naturally than usual. "Peterson is pleased, and the buyer was so impressed with the horse's condition that he paid above the asking price." "That's wonderful." Tessa's genuine pleasure in his success warmed something within him. "Papa will be glad to hear it. He's been saying Whiterock needs more success stories to attract new settlers." The mention of Richard Palmer reminded Ethan of their last conversation. "Is your father here?" "No, he's meeting with the town council about expanding the store." Tessa tilted her head slightly. "Why did you need to speak with him?" Ethan hesitated. In truth, he'd hoped to find Tessa alone, though he hadn't admitted that to himself until now. "Actually, I brought something for you." He reached into his saddlebag, retrieving the wrapped journal. "It's not much, but I saw it in Helena and thought of you." Tessa accepted the package with surprise in her eyes. "You bought me a gift." "If that's improper—" "No," she interrupted quickly, "it's not improper. It's thoughtful." Her fingers carefully unwrapped the paper, revealing the leather-bound journal with its cream-colored pages. "Oh, Ethan, it's beautiful." "I remembered you mentioned liking to write," he said, suddenly feeling awkward. "Like your mother." Tessa ran her fingers over the soft leather, her expression soft with genuine pleasure. "Thank you, this means more than you know." Something in her voice, in the way she cradled the journal, made Ethan bold. "Would you have dinner with me tonight, at the hotel restaurant? I'd like to hear about everything that happened while I was away." The invitation hung between them, more than a casual meal between friends, less than a formal courtship call, but significant nonetheless. Yes, Tessa replied without hesitation. I'd like that very much. The store closes at 6. I'll come for you at 7 then. Ethan replaced his hat, suddenly eager to prepare for the evening ahead. If your father objects. Let me worry about Papa, Tessa said with a smile that held a hint of mischief. He knows I'm old enough to have dinner with a friend. Friend? The word simultaneously felt like too much and not enough to describe what was growing between them. Ethan nodded, unwilling to examine the semantics too closely. Until tonight, then. As he stepped back onto the street, the afternoon sunlight seemed brighter somehow, the air fresher, the future more inviting than it had in years. Peterson's offer lingered in his mind, a cabin by the creek, honest work with horses, the beginnings of a place in the community. For the first time since his parents' deaths, Ethan allowed himself to imagine staying somewhere, building something. The image was both terrifying and alluring, a life with roots, with connection, with all the vulnerability that entailed. Whether such a life could include Tessa Palmer remained to be seen. But for now, the possibility was enough to fill Ethan with an unfamiliar sensation that felt suspiciously like hope. Dinner at the Whiterock Hotel's modest restaurant proved to be the first of many evenings Ethan and Tessa spent together over the following weeks. With Richard Palmer's reluctant blessing, secured after Ethan formally requested permission to court his daughter, they established a rhythm of shared meals, walks along the creek that ran behind the town, and quiet conversations on the mercantile's porch after closing. Ethan had accepted Peterson's offer of employment, though he continued to stay at the boarding house rather than moving to the line cabin immediately. The decision to remain in Whiterock had come easier than he'd expected, though he still awoke sometimes in the night, heart racing with the old instinct to move on before attachment grew too deep. Yet each time he considered leaving, the image of Tessa's face would rise in his mind. Her smile when she spotted him entering the mercantile, her laughter when he told stories of his travels, her quiet attentiveness when he gradually began sharing pieces of his past. It was during one such evening, nearly a month after his return from Helena, that Ethan finally spoke of the events that had shaped his solitary existence. They sat on a fallen log beside the creek, the setting sun painting the water with gold and crimson. Tessa wore a simple calico dress, her golden hair loose around her shoulders in the way Ethan had come to prefer. My parents came west in '55, he began, his voice low but steady. Father had been a carpenter back east, but he dreamed of having his own land. Mother followed him willingly, though I think she was terrified. I was 12. Tessa remained silent, her hand resting lightly on his arm in encouragement. We settled north of here, built a small cabin, planted crops. Ethan stared at the flowing water, seeing instead the past. The first year was hard but promising. Father talked about expanding, about building a proper house once we were established. He paused, the familiar pain rising in his throat. Then winter came early, snows like no one had seen in decades. You were isolated, Tessa said softly, understanding dawning in her eyes. Ethan nodded. Completely. Our nearest neighbors were 5 miles away, too far to reach when the blizzards hit. By January, our supplies were running dangerously low. His hand clenched unconsciously. Father went hunting, desperate for fresh meat. He didn't return before the next storm hit. Tessa's fingers tightened on his arm. Oh, Ethan. Mother and I waited 3 days. When the snow let up, I went looking for him. The memory was still vivid, the biting cold, the endless white landscape, the growing fear as he called his father's name into the silent wilderness. I found him a mile from the cabin. He'd broken his leg, tried to crawl back. Ethan's voice grew rough. He'd frozen to death less than an hour before I reached him. Tessa's eyes shimmered with unshed tears, but she didn't interrupt. I buried him as best I could in the frozen ground and returned to Mother. She'd always been delicate, but after that, he shook his head. She stopped eating, stopped fighting. The fever took her 2 weeks later. You were alone, Tessa whispered, at 12 years old. Yes, Ethan finally turned to look at her, needing her to understand. I survived that winter by eating our seed corn and burning furniture for warmth. When spring came, I walked until I found a settlement, told them my parents had died of fever. He drew a deep breath. I've been moving ever since, never staying anywhere long enough to, he trailed off. To care, Tessa finished for him, to risk losing someone again. Ethan nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in his throat. For 13 years, he'd carried these memories alone, sharing them with no one. Now, having spoken them aloud, he felt both exposed and somehow lighter. Tessa reached up, her fingers gentle against his cheek. "Thank you for telling me." "Now you understand why I have nothing to offer," Ethan said quietly. "No roots, no family, no history worth sharing, just survival." "Is that truly all you see when you look at yourself?" Tessa's question held no judgment, only genuine curiosity. "Because I see a man who survived unimaginable loss, who built a life through intelligence and skill, who steps between danger and others without hesitation." Her hand remained against his face, her touch anchoring him to the present. "I see a man of honor and capability, whose word can be trusted. Those things have value far beyond property or position, Ethan." Her words washed over him like a benediction, challenging the narrative he'd constructed about himself over years of solitude. Could she be right? Was there more to him than the absence of connections? "Peterson offered me the line cabin," he said abruptly. "As part of my employment, it's small but solid, could be expanded." Tessa's eyes widened slightly. "Are you considering it?" "I've already accepted the job," Ethan replied, watching her carefully. "The cabin is part of the arrangement." "So you're staying in Whiterock?" Her voice held carefully controlled hope. "I'm trying to," he admitted. "It's not easy, Tessa. The urge to move on is ingrained, but for the first time in years I want to fight it." He took her hand, his calloused fingers engulfing her smaller ones. "Because of you. Because when I'm with you, I can imagine a different kind of life." Tessa's fingers tightened around his. "What kind of life, Ethan?" The question hung between them in the gathering dusk, not a demand, but an invitation to articulate the future he was beginning to envision. Ethan took a deep breath, finding courage in her steady gaze. A life with purpose beyond survival, with connections to people and place. He hesitated, then added softly, "A life shared, not endured alone." Tessa's smile illuminated her face, reaching her eyes where tears still lingered. "I would like that life too, Ethan, very much." As they sat beside the creek, hands intertwined and futures tentatively aligning, Ethan felt something shift within his chest. A loosening of the armor he'd worn for so long, a cautious opening to possibilities he'd denied himself for 13 years. He still had nothing tangible to offer, no established home, no family connections, no fortune. But for the first time he began to believe that perhaps that wasn't all that mattered. Perhaps, as Tessa had said, there were other measures of a man's worth, and perhaps, just perhaps, he might be worthy after all. Summer settled over Whiterock like a warm blanket, bringing long days of sunshine and prosperity. The town flourished with the season. New buildings rose along the main street, the stage arrived twice weekly now instead of once, and talk of the railroad reaching them within 2 years created an atmosphere of optimism and growth. For Tessa, the summer passed in a golden haze of happiness unlike anything she'd known before. Her days remained structured around the mercantile, helping her father as always, but her evenings and Sundays belonged increasingly to Ethan. Their courtship progressed with a measured pace that respected both her father's concerns and Ethan's lingering caution. Yet beneath the propriety, a deepening connection flourished, built on conversations that lasted until stars filled the night sky, shared dreams cautiously revealed, and a growing understanding that transcended words. By late August, Ethan had completed basic improvements to the line cabin, transforming it from a functional shelter for seasonal workers to a modest but comfortable home. The single room had been meticulously repaired, a proper stone chimney replaced the dangerous metal stovepipe, and a small porch provided a place to watch sunsets over the creek. It was to this cabin that Ethan invited both Tessa and her father for Sunday dinner after church, a significant gesture that wasn't lost on either Palmer. "He's establishing himself," Richard observed as they prepared to leave the mercantile apartment that Sunday. "Showing he can provide a proper home." Tessa adjusted her hat in the mirror, trying to contain her excitement behind a composed exterior. "The cabin is just the beginning, Papa, Mr. Peterson has given Ethan responsibility for the entire horse breeding program. In time, he could have his own land." Richard studied his daughter, his expression softening. "It's not the cabin or land that concerns me, Tessa. It's whether he's truly put his wandering days behind him." He took her hands in his. I see how you look at him, how deeply your feelings run. I couldn't bear to see you heartbroken if the trail calls him away again. He's fighting those instincts every day, Papa, Tessa replied, her voice gentle but firm. For me, for the future we might have together, that takes more courage than you know. Her father sighed, patting her hand. You have your mother's faith in people. I pray it serves you better than it did her. The cryptic comment lingered in Tessa's mind as they rode in the buggy toward Peterson's ranch and the line cabin by the creek. What had her father meant? Her mother had loved him faithfully until her death. What disappointment could he be referring to? Such thoughts scattered, however, when they arrived to find Ethan waiting on the porch, looking more nervous than Tessa had ever seen him. He wore his best clothes, a proper shirt and vest rather than his usual work attire, and had clearly gone to great lengths to prepare for their visit. Welcome, he said, helping Tessa down from the buggy with gentle hands. Thank you for coming, Mr. Palmer. Impressive improvements, Richard commented, surveying the cabin and its surroundings. A small garden had been started along one side, and flowers bloomed in a bed near the porch steps, touches that spoke of permanence, of settling in. Peterson provided the materials, Ethan replied modestly. The work was the easy part. Inside, the cabin revealed Ethan's careful attention to detail. The plank floors had been sanded smooth, the walls whitewashed to brighten the space. A sturdy table with 4 chairs occupied one end of the room, set with mismatched but clean dishes. At the other end, a bedstead with a cornhusk mattress was partially screened by a curtain for privacy. It was simple, functional, and impeccably clean, the home of a man with little experience in such matters but determined to create something worthy of guests. Of family, perhaps. It's wonderful, Ethan, Tessa said, genuinely impressed by the transformation. She had seen the cabin in its earlier state, when it had been little more than a shelter for ranch hands during calving season. It's just a beginning, he replied, his eyes meeting hers with meaning that transcended the humble surroundings. Dinner proved surprisingly delicious, a savory stew Ethan had prepared under the guidance of Peterson's cook, fresh bread from town, and blackberry cobbler for dessert. Throughout the meal, Tessa observed the interaction between Ethan and her father with growing hope. The initial formality gradually gave way to easier conversation as Richard recognized Ethan's sincere efforts and evident capabilities. After the meal, as Tessa helped clear the dishes, her father and Ethan stepped onto the porch. Through the open door, she could hear fragments of their conversation, serious tones discussing the horse breeding program, Peterson's expansion plans, the prospects for Whiterock's growth. When she joined them, carrying coffee, the men fell silent in a way that suggested their discussion had shifted to more personal matters. Richard accepted his cup with a thoughtful expression, while Ethan's eyes held a mixture of tension and determination that piqued Tessa's curiosity. The sunset is beautiful from here, she observed, hoping to ease whatever had created the sudden tension. One of the reasons I chose this cabin, Ethan replied, visibly relaxing as he took the cup she offered. The creek catches the light just right. They watched in companionable silence as the sun sank toward the western mountains, painting the landscape in amber and gold. In that moment, with Ethan beside her and her father's tacit presence, Tessa felt a sense of rightness that transcended the humble setting. This connection, this shared beauty, this feeling of belonging, was what she had longed for without fully understanding. As twilight descended, Richard announced it was time to return to town. Ethan helped Tessa into the buggy, his hands lingering slightly longer than necessary, his eyes communicating unspoken thoughts. Thank you for coming, he said, his voice carrying a deeper meaning. It meant a great deal to me. Thank you for having us, Tessa replied, fighting the urge to reach for his hand again. The cabin is lovely, Ethan. Truly. As the buggy pulled away, Tessa glanced back to see Ethan standing before his cabin, silhouetted against the last light of day. The image burned itself into her memory, a man who had chosen to stop running, who was building something from nothing, who looked after them with longing that matched her own. He asked for my blessing, Richard said abruptly when they were halfway back to town, to court you formally with intention toward marriage. Tessa's heart leapt in her chest. What did you say? Her father was silent for a long moment, the only sound the steady clip of the horse's hooves and the creak of buggy wheels. I said that while I appreciate his honesty and evident efforts to establish himself, I would need to see more evidence of his commitment to staying in one place. That permanent decisions require permanent intentions. Disappointment washed over Tessa, though she understood her father's caution. Papa, Ethan has changed his entire life. I didn't refuse Tessa, Richard interrupted gently. I simply asked for time, for all our sakes, including his. He glanced at her, his expression softening in the gathering darkness. If his feelings are genuine, if his commitment to Whiterock is real, a few more months will only strengthen his resolve, not weaken it. Tessa nodded, recognizing the wisdom in her father's approach despite her impatience. Ethan was still healing from old wounds, still learning to trust in permanence again. Perhaps time would indeed prove beneficial for them both. "Did he accept your terms?" she asked finally. "He did." Richard's voice held a note of respect. "Said he understood my concerns and would prove himself worthy of my trust. That you were worth waiting for, worth changing for." The words sent a warm glow through Tessa's chest. Despite her father's caution, despite the wait still ahead, she felt a certainty that had been building all summer. Ethan Irving was a man worth believing in, a man who, despite claiming to have nothing to offer, had given her the most precious gift of all. His heart, slowly healing but genuinely offered. That night, as Tessa prepared for bed, she wrote in the journal Ethan had given her. Words of hope and patience, of dreams taking shape, of a future gradually revealing itself with each passing day. Outside her window, stars filled the Montana sky, the same stars visible from a small cabin by a creek where a solitary man was learning to believe in belonging again. Autumn painted the Montana landscape in hues of gold and crimson as Ethan settled into a rhythm previously unknown in his adult life. Each day brought familiar tasks that built upon the previous day's work, training young horses, selecting breeding stock with Peterson, improving the cabin with an eye toward the approaching winter. Each evening ended with the knowledge that tomorrow would unfold in the same place, among these same people. The stability still occasionally triggered his old instincts to flee, especially on nights when dreams of frozen landscapes and dying parents jolted him awake, heart pounding with remembered grief. Yet increasingly, these moments of panic were counterbalanced by new memories being created. Sunday dinners with the Palmers, community gatherings where he was now greeted by name, and most significantly, time spent with Tessa. Their courtship had progressed with careful propriety under Richard Palmer's watchful eye. Chaperoned walks, visits to the cabin with her father present, shared meals in the hotel restaurant where the entire town could observe their decorum. Yet within these boundaries, their connection deepened through conversations that revealed their mutual longing for something meaningful amid frontier challenges. Ethan learned that Tessa's apparent contentment with mercantile life masked a spirit as restless as his own, though directed differently. Where he had sought solitude and movement to outrun pain, she yearned for purpose beyond the conventional paths available to women in frontier towns. "I love Papa, and I understand the security the store represents," she confided one Sunday afternoon as they walked along the creek near his cabin, her father watching from the porch. "But sometimes I feel there must be more I could contribute." "You have a gift for healing," Ethan observed. "I've seen how people seek your help when the doctor is unavailable." Tessa nodded, her expression brightening. "I've been reading medical texts Doc Walsh lends me. He says with proper training I could become a nurse or even a midwife." She glanced back toward her father, lowering her voice. "But Papa worries about such ambitions. He thinks a woman's place is in the home, raising children." "Why not both?" Ethan suggested. "Many frontier women combine family responsibilities with practical skills the community needs." The smile she gave him held such warmth that Ethan felt something shift within his chest, a final barrier yielding to the inevitable. In that moment, watching sunlight play through her golden hair, he knew with sudden clarity that his future belonged with this remarkable woman, if she would have him. October brought the first frost, and with it, new challenges. Preparations for winter consumed the ranch, while in town, the mercantile stocked supplies for the months when travel might become difficult. Ethan found himself spending more time in Whiterock, helping Richard Palmer move heavy inventory and repair the store's roof before snow arrived. These shared tasks gradually thawed the older man's reserve toward Ethan. One evening, as they finished securing a shipment of flour in the mercantile's storeroom, Richard studied Ethan with thoughtful eyes. "You've surprised me, Irving," he said candidly. "When you first started calling on Tessa, I was certain you'd be gone by first snowfall." Ethan wiped dust from his hands, meeting the older man's gaze directly. I'm surprised myself sometimes, sir, but I've found reasons to stay that outweigh old habits. My daughter being chief among them, I presume. Yes, sir, though Whiterock itself has merits I didn't appreciate initially. Richard nodded, satisfaction evident in his expression. A man needs more than one anchor to weather life's storms. Community matters as much as individual connections. The observation resonated with Ethan's own evolving understanding. His growing attachment to Tessa had opened him to other relationships as well. Friendships with ranch hands who had initially viewed him with suspicion, regular conversations with townspeople who now greeted him by name, even a grudging respect for Sheriff Harding, who had begun consulting him about horses for the town's small police force. Mr. Palmer, Ethan said, seizing the moment, the 3 months you asked for have passed. I've established myself here, proven my commitment to remaining in Whiterock. He straightened, meeting the older man's eyes directly. I'd like your blessing to ask for Tessa's hand. Richard didn't appear surprised by the request. He studied Ethan silently for a long moment before responding. Winter is coming, he said finally, the true test of frontier commitment. Survive until spring without the urge to move on, build something more substantial than that one-room cabin, and we'll speak of this again. Disappointment washed through Ethan, though he maintained his composed expression. You still don't trust my intentions. I trust your current intentions completely, Richard replied, his tone softening. But I also understand how winter changes perspectives, especially for a man accustomed to following the seasons south. Tessa deserves certainty, Ethan, complete certainty. Though frustrated by the continued delay, Ethan recognized the wisdom in Richard's caution. The coming winter would indeed test his resolve, not just his willingness to endure Montana's harsh weather, but his commitment to putting down permanent roots. I understand, sir, he said finally, and I'll prove myself worthy of her. Richard clasped his shoulder briefly. I believe you will, and that's progress neither of us expected 6 months ago. As Ethan left the mercantile that evening, the first snow of the season began to fall, delicate flakes drifting from a leaden sky, transforming Whiterock into a scene from a storybook. The beauty of it caught him by surprise, reminding him of childhood winters before tragedy struck, when snow had meant sleigh rides and snowball fights rather than isolation and death. Perhaps this winter could create new associations, new memories to overlay the painful ones that had shaped his adult life. Perhaps, with Tessa and the community of Whiterock, he could finally reclaim the season that had taken so much from him. With renewed determination, Ethan turned toward the livery where Storm waited. He had preparations to make if he was going to build something more substantial before spring, plans that would require Peterson's cooperation, the town's sawmill's resources, and his own skills as a carpenter's son, long unused but not forgotten. The winter ahead might be a challenge, but it was also an opportunity to demonstrate, once and for all, that Ethan Irving was a man who could not only survive but build a future worth sharing. The first major snowfall transformed Whiterock overnight, muffling sounds and softening the frontier town's rough edges beneath a pristine blanket of white. Tessa stood at the mercantile window, watching townspeople navigate the newly transformed landscape with varying degrees of skill and enthusiasm. Children darted between buildings, throwing hastily formed snowballs and leaving chaotic trails of footprints. Adults moved with more purpose, carrying supplies or clearing paths with shovels. The livery was especially busy as ranchers from outlying areas hurried to complete business before the weather worsened. Tessa's attention focused on one particular figure, Ethan, leading a heavily laden wagon toward the sawmill at the edge of town. For the past week, he had been making similar trips, transporting logs from Peterson's land to be cut into lumber. He had been mysteriously tight-lipped about his project, deflecting her questions with good-natured evasion. That young man has something significant planned, her father observed, joining her at the window. Peterson mentioned he's been cutting trees from the South Ridge, good building timber. He won't tell me what he's building, Tessa replied, unable to keep a note of frustration from her voice. Just says it's a winter project to keep him occupied during the slow months. Richard chuckled. Patience was never your strongest virtue, Tessa, like your mother in that regard. The mention of her mother, more frequent now than in previous years, prompted Tessa to voice the question that had lingered since their Sunday visit to Ethan's cabin months earlier. "Papa, what did you mean when you said Mother's faith in people hadn't served her well? You spoke as though she had been disappointed somehow." Richard's expression sobered as he turned away from the window. For a moment, Tessa thought he might avoid the question, as he had so many times before when her mother's memory arose. Instead, he gestured toward the chairs near the store's pot-bellied stove. "Perhaps it's time you knew," he said, his voice carrying the weight of old sorrows. "Especially now when your own heart is engaged." They sat across from each other in the quiet store, the snow outside creating an unusual stillness that seemed to suspend ordinary time. Richard stared into the fire for several moments before speaking. "Your mother didn't come west willingly," he began. "She followed me out of love, leaving behind a comfortable life in Boston, family, friends, cultural advantages I couldn't provide on the frontier." He sighed heavily. "I promised her prosperity, security, a community where she would flourish. Instead, I delivered years of hardship, isolation, and struggle." "But she loved you," Tessa said gently. "She never complained in my memory." "Not to you, no. Elizabeth was determined you would see only the beauty in our frontier life." Richard's eyes grew distant with memory. "But in private moments, especially during those long winters, I saw the toll our life took on her spirit. She missed music, books, intellectual conversation, the refinements that had been part of her upbringing." Tessa absorbed this revelation about her mother, a woman she had idealized in memory but perhaps never truly known. "Did she regret coming west?" she asked hesitantly. "No, not ultimately. She found purpose in creating a home, in raising you, in helping build Whiterock into more than just a trading post." Richard's expression softened. "But there were dark times when I feared I had destroyed something precious in her, a brightness that the frontier's hardships gradually dimmed." "Is that why you've been so cautious about Ethan? You fear I might experience similar disappointments?" "Partly," Richard admitted, "but your situation differs from your mother's in important ways. You were born to this life, its hardships don't come as a shock to you as they did to her." "And Ethan," he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "Ethan may have nothing material to offer, but he understands frontier challenges in ways I never did when I brought your mother west. My concerns about him have never been about his capabilities or character, only his permanence." Tessa considered her father's words, finding in them a new understanding of both her parents, her mother's quiet sacrifices, her father's lingering guilt. It explained much about his protective stance toward her, his emphasis on security and stability. "I believe in Ethan's commitment," she said finally, "not just to me, but to the life he's building here. I see his struggle against old instincts, Papa, his courage in facing the very season that once destroyed his family." Richard reached across to take her hand. "I see it too, Tessa. And it gives me hope that perhaps your faith in him is justified after all." Their conversation was interrupted by the store's bell as customers entered, shaking snow from coats and boots. Tessa rose to assist them, her mind still processing her father's revelations. Throughout the day, as she served customers and managed inventory, she found herself watching the street for glimpses of Ethan's wagon, wondering what future he was literally constructing beyond the town's edge. 2 days later, Tessa received a note delivered by Jimmy from the Peterson ranch. Written in Ethan's careful hand, it invited her and her father to visit the line cabin the following Sunday after church, to see progress on a project I hope will meet with your approval. The formal wording made Tessa smile, recognizing Ethan's attempt at proper etiquette despite his limited experience with social niceties. She showed the note to her father, who read it with raised eyebrows. "Interesting timing," he commented. "The first significant project is ready for inspection, it seems." "Will you come?" Tessa asked, trying to keep the eagerness from her voice. Richard nodded, a slight smile softening his features. "I find myself curious about what the young man has been constructing so diligently." Sunday dawned bright and cold, the snow sparkling like diamonds under a brilliant blue sky. After church services, where Ethan had joined them in the Palmers' regular pew for the third consecutive week, they traveled to the line cabin in Richard's enclosed buggy. As they approached the familiar clearing by the creek, Tessa gasped in surprise. Beside the original cabin stood the frame of a new structure, the beginnings of a proper house, its skeleton rising promisingly against the winter landscape. Though still in early stages of construction, its dimensions suggested a substantial dwelling with multiple rooms. Ethan waited on the original cabin's porch, his expression a mixture of pride and nervousness as he watched their approach. He helped Tessa from the buggy with careful hands, his eyes searching her face for her reaction. "You're building a house," she said, unable to keep the wonder from her voice. "I'm trying to," he replied with a self-deprecating smile. "It's been some years since I helped my father with carpentry, but the skills are returning." Richard circled the new construction with experienced eyes, examining the foundation and frame with evident approval. "Solid work," he commented, running a hand along one of the support beams. "2 stories." "Yes, sir, 4 rooms downstairs, kitchen, dining room, sitting room, and study, 3 bedrooms upstairs." Ethan's gaze flickered briefly to Tessa before returning to her father. "Room for a family to grow." The implication hung in the crystal-clear winter air. This was no bachelor's cabin or temporary shelter, but a permanent home designed for generations. A declaration in lumber and nails that spoke more eloquently than words of Ethan's intentions toward Whiterock and toward Tessa. "Peterson has been most generous," Ethan continued, guiding them through the structure. "He's provided the land, 5 acres around the cabin, as part of my compensation for developing the horse program. Says a married foreman is more likely to remain loyal to the ranch." Tessa felt her cheeks warm at the casual mention of marriage, though Ethan had made no formal proposal. Her father noticed too, his expression thoughtful as he continued to examine the construction. "How soon do you expect to complete it?" Richard asked. "The exterior should be finished before the worst winter weather sets in," Ethan replied. "Interior work can continue regardless of conditions. By spring, it will be habitable." "Ambitious timeline," Richard observed, though his tone held approval rather than doubt. "I have strong motivation, sir," Ethan said, his eyes meeting Richard's with quiet determination. While the men discussed construction details, Tessa wandered through the framed rooms, imagining walls and furnishings, a cooking stove in the kitchen, bookshelves in the study, curtains at windows not yet installed. It was easy to picture a life within these emerging spaces, a future taking physical form before her eyes. When she rejoined Ethan and her father, they had moved to the original cabin, where Ethan had prepared coffee and a simple meal. As they sat at the sturdy table, warmth from the stone fireplace creating a cozy atmosphere despite the snow visible through the windows, Tessa felt a sense of rightness that transcended the humble surroundings. "Your mother would be proud," Richard said unexpectedly, breaking a momentary silence, "to see the carpenter's skills passed down." Ethan looked up sharply, surprise evident in his expression. It was perhaps the first time her father had made such a personal comment about Ethan's past without an accompanying caution or reservation. "Thank you, sir," Ethan replied, his voice rough with emotion. "That means more than I can express." As they prepared to depart later that afternoon, Richard announced he needed to check something on the buggy, tactfully giving Ethan and Tessa a moment of relative privacy on the cabin porch. The sun was beginning its descent, casting long blue shadows across the snow-covered landscape. "Do you approve?" Ethan asked quietly, his breath forming white clouds in the winter air. "Of the house, I mean." Tessa turned to face him fully, no longer concerned with maintaining proper distance under her father's watchful eye. "It's wonderful, Ethan, truly." She hesitated, then asked the question foremost in her mind. "Is it for us for a future together?" Ethan's eyes, so often guarded, held nothing but openness as they met hers. "Yes, if you'll have me, Tessa, if you can accept a man who brings nothing but his hands and heart." "Those are the only things that matter," she replied softly. For a moment she thought he might kiss her, propriety and her father's nearby presence notwithstanding. Instead, he took her gloved hand in his, pressing it gently. "I haven't asked your father's final blessing yet," he said. "He set conditions, winter's passage, a proper home. I'm working to meet them." "And when they're met," Tessa prompted, her heart beating a rapid rhythm against her ribs, "then, if you're willing, I'll ask you properly." "With whatever small token I can provide." His expression turned suddenly uncertain. "Unless you've reconsidered, a mercantile owner's daughter could expect better prospects than a ranch foreman." Tessa shook her head, unable to suppress a smile at his doubt. I've had better prospects calling at the store for years, Ethan Irving. None of them ever saw me, just a convenient addition to a business arrangement. She squeezed his hand. You saw me from the beginning. The vulnerability in his expression transformed into something warmer, more certain. From the first moment, he agreed, though I fought against it with everything I had. I'm glad you lost that particular battle, Tessa replied, her smile widening. From the yard, her father cleared his throat pointedly. The sound broke the intimate moment, reminding them of propriety's boundaries. Yet as Ethan helped her into the buggy, his touch lingering just a heartbeat longer than necessary, Tessa felt the promise between them solidifying into certainty. Winter might still test Ethan's resolve, but the house rising beside the creek spoke volumes about his intentions. For a man who had spent 13 years avoiding permanence, each nail driven was a declaration of commitment, to Whiterock, to putting down roots, and to a future that included her. As they drove away, Tessa looked back to see Ethan standing between the original cabin and the new structure rising beside it. A man bridging his solitary past and a future filled with possibility. The image stayed with her long after they returned to town, warming her through the cold winter night that followed. December brought the full force of Montana winter to Whiterock and the surrounding territory. Heavy snows alternated with periods of bitter cold, transforming the landscape into a challenging environment that tested even long-time residents. For those living on outlying homesteads and ranches, trips to town became carefully planned expeditions rather than casual visits. Ethan faced the season with grim determination, dividing his time between Peterson's horses, which required constant attention in the harsh weather, and the house construction, which proceeded more slowly than he'd hoped due to the conditions. Each morning he rose before dawn, tending to the animals by lantern light, then worked on the house until darkness fell again. The physical labor served as both distraction and therapy, keeping his hands busy when memories of that long-ago winter threatened to overwhelm him. At night, exhausted but unable to sleep, he would stare into the cabin's fire, fighting the ghosts that seemed closer during these cold, dark months. Yet unlike that devastating winter of his childhood, Ethan was no longer alone. Twice weekly, weather permitting, he made the journey into Whiterock, ostensibly for supplies, but primarily to see Tessa. These visits became his anchor, something to anticipate when the isolation of ranch life pressed too heavily upon him. The town itself seemed determined to combat winter's hardships with community spirit. Church socials, quilting bees, and impromptu gatherings in the hotel's small dining room created opportunities for connection when the weather might otherwise have kept people isolated in their homes. Ethan, to his own surprise, found himself increasingly included in these events. No longer the stranger passing through, but a recognized member of Whiterock's extended family. It was at one such gathering, a Christmas Eve celebration at the church, that Ethan experienced a profound shift in his relationship with the community. The simple wooden structure had been decorated with evergreen boughs and candles, creating a warm, fragrant sanctuary from the swirling snow outside. Nearly every resident of Whiterock had braved the weather to attend, the shared experience of Christmas transcending the frontier's usual pragmatism. Ethan sat beside Tessa and her father in their usual pew, uncomfortably aware of his best but still rough attire among families dressed in their finest. The small gift in his pocket, a delicate silver brooch he'd commissioned from a traveling silversmith, seemed suddenly inadequate as he observed other young men presenting their sweethearts with more substantial offerings. After the service, as the congregation lingered to share holiday wishes and small gifts, Sheriff Harding approached Ethan with unusual solemnity. "Irving, got a moment?" the lawman asked, gesturing toward a quiet corner. Concerned, Ethan followed, wondering what problem could require the sheriff's attention on Christmas Eve. "Something wrong, Sheriff." "Not wrong exactly." Harding seemed uncharacteristically hesitant. "Got word from the territorial marshal's office. They've been tracking that rustler gang we encountered last spring." Ethan tensed. The memory of the confrontation, the violence, the life he'd been forced to take, remained a shadow in his mind. "I thought that business was finished." "Mostly is. They've rounded up the remaining members." Harding cleared his throat, "found some interesting items among their belongings, including this." He withdrew a folded paper from his coat pocket, handing it to Ethan. In the candlelight, Ethan unfolded what proved to be a wanted poster. his own face crudely sketched beneath the bold word WANTED. The charge listed was murder, the location Nebraska Territory, the date 7 years earlier. A date and place Ethan remembered all too well. "This is a lie," he said quietly, his voice steady despite the sudden hammering of his heart. "I've never murdered anyone." Harding nodded, unsurprised by the denial. "Figured as much. Marshall says these false posters are one of the gang's tactics, creating trouble for those who cross them. They distributed several after we broke up their operation here." He took the poster back, folding it deliberately. "I'm burning this, Irving. Far as I'm concerned, you've proven your character to Whiterock. Whatever happened in your past, it's your business." Relief washed through Ethan, followed quickly by a surge of gratitude that left him momentarily speechless. The sheriff was offering more than just dismissal of false charges. He was offering trust, acceptance, the benefit of doubt that frontier justice rarely extended. "Thank you," Ethan managed finally. "There are things in my past I'm not proud of, Sheriff, but murder isn't among them." Harding clapped him on the shoulder. "We've all got chapters we'd rather not read aloud, son. What matters is the story you're writing now." He nodded toward where Tessa stood with a group of women, her golden hair illuminated by candlelight. "And that looks to be a promising tale indeed." As the sheriff moved away, Ethan remained in the corner, processing the exchange. The poster was a stark reminder of how precarious his situation might have been, how easily his efforts to build a new life could have been derailed by shadows from his past. Yet instead of suspicion and accusation, he had been met with trust and acceptance. Whiterock had defended him in his absence, claimed him as one of their own. The revelation shook something loose within Ethan's chest, a final barrier yielding to the inevitable. This community, with all its imperfections and limitations, had offered him what he had been seeking without realizing it: belonging. Not just through his connection to Tessa, but in his own right, as a man judged by his present actions rather than his past wanderings. When Tessa joined him moments later, her face glowing with holiday spirit, Ethan made a decision that altered his careful timeline. "Would you walk with me?" he asked impulsively. "Just to the church steps and back. I need a moment away from the crowd." Concern crossed her features. "Is something wrong? You look unsettled." "Nothing wrong," he assured her, offering his arm. "Quite the opposite." After a quick glance toward her father, who gave a slight nod of permission, Tessa accompanied Ethan to the church entrance. Outside, snow fell in large, gentle flakes, muffling the town's usual sounds and creating an intimate silence broken only by distant laughter from within the church. "It's beautiful," Tessa breathed, watching the snow transform Whiterock into a scene from a storybook. "Like the world is being made new." "Perhaps it is," Ethan replied, his voice rough with emotion. "At least for me." She turned to him, her green eyes reflecting the light spilling from the church windows. "What do you mean?" Ethan took both her hands in his, no longer concerned with who might observe them from inside. "I've been working toward spring, toward meeting your father's conditions, toward asking you properly when the house is finished." He shook his head, smiling ruefully. "But I find I can't wait any longer, Tessa Palmer." Her eyes widened as understanding dawned. "Oh, Ethan, I have nothing to offer," he said softly, echoing words spoken to himself countless times since meeting her. "No fortune, no distinguished name, no grand property. Just a half-built house, a position that depends on another man's success, and a past better forgotten than examined." "Ethan," she began again, but he continued, needing to speak the truth in its entirety. "But I love you, Tessa. With everything I am and everything I hope to become. I love your kindness and your courage, your intelligence and your faith in possibilities I couldn't see before knowing you." His voice grew stronger, more certain. "I can't offer security or luxury, but I can promise to build a life worthy of you, to work every day to be the man you believe I can be." Tears shimmered in Tessa's eyes, catching the candlelight like diamonds. "Those are the only promises that matter," she whispered. From his pocket, Ethan withdrew the small package containing the silver brooch. It seemed even more inadequate now, yet he offered it with steady hands. "I haven't spoken to your father again," he admitted. "This isn't a proper proposal, just a promise, a declaration of intent." Tessa accepted the package but didn't open it. Instead, she stepped closer, her free hand coming to rest against his cheek. I don't need grand gestures or formal permissions, Ethan. I've known my heart since summer. The simplicity of her acceptance, the certainty in her voice, undid the last of Ethan's reservations. With gentle reverence, he lowered his lips to hers. Their first kiss, shared in the falling snow on Christmas Eve, witnessed only by the stars emerging between snow clouds above. It was brief, proper by any standard, yet Ethan felt the contact throughout his entire being, a confirmation of everything that had been growing between them since that first meeting in the mercantile. When they parted, Tessa's smile held a radiance that outshone the candles illuminating the church behind them. "Merry Christmas, Ethan Irving," she said softly. "Merry Christmas, Tessa Palmer," he replied, his voice husky with emotion. "The first of many, if you'll have me." "I will," she answered simply. "In spring, when the house is finished and Papa gives his blessing, or in 10 winters if that's what it takes. Some things are worth waiting for." As they returned to the church, snow dusting their shoulders and a new understanding binding their hearts, Ethan felt a certainty he had never expected to experience. The wanderer had found his home, not just in a place or a building, but in a community that accepted him and a woman who saw beyond his carefully constructed defenses to the man he could become. For the first time since childhood, Ethan Irving celebrated Christmas with genuine joy, surrounded by neighbors who had become friends and seated beside the woman who had become his future. The ghosts of winters past seemed suddenly less powerful, less defining, as new memories were created in their place. Later that night, as he rode back to the line cabin through gently falling snow, Ethan felt no urge to continue beyond Whiterock, no restlessness pushing him toward distant horizons. Instead, he turned his thoughts toward the house taking shape beside the creek, to rooms that would hold laughter and conversation, to a future shared rather than a past fled. He had found in the most unexpected place something worth building upon, something worth staying for. January and February tested Whiterock with some of the harshest weather in memory. Blizzards swept across the territory, isolating outlying ranches for days at a time and forcing townspeople to create tunnels through snowdrifts that sometimes reached second-story windows. Cold so bitter it froze breath into ice crystals challenged even the most seasoned residents. For Tessa, the severe conditions brought both frustration and unexpected gifts. Frustration came from reduced communication with Ethan, whose visits to town became less frequent as travel grew more hazardous. Yet the enforced separation also provided precious time for reflection and preparation. With her father's cautious blessing, given after Ethan had spoken to him privately following the Christmas Eve service, Tessa began assembling items for her hope chest. Some afternoons found her sewing with the church ladies, creating linens and quilts under their expert guidance. Other days she cataloged recipes copied from her father's customers, practiced bread-making techniques Mrs. Henderson insisted every wife should master, and read medical texts Doc Walsh continued to provide, determined to maintain her healing skills alongside domestic ones. Richard Palmer watched these preparations with mixed emotions evident in his eyes, pride in his daughter's capabilities, sorrow at the approaching change in their household, and lingering concern about the match itself. Yet even he had to admit that Ethan had proven his commitment beyond reasonable doubt. "The man rode 12 miles through a blizzard last week just to make sure we had enough firewood," Richard commented one evening as they sat by the store's stove. "Wouldn't even stay for supper, said Peterson's horses needed attention before the next storm hit." "He takes his responsibilities seriously," Tessa replied, unable to keep pride from her voice. "Mr. Peterson says he's the most reliable foreman he's ever employed." Richard nodded, his expression thoughtful. Reliability is no small virtue on the frontier. He stoked the fire, adding another log before continuing. "I received a letter from Thomas Wilson today. He's established his freight business in Helena quite successfully from his account." The mention of her former suitor caught Tessa by surprise. "That's nice for him," she said carefully. "Indeed." "He inquired about you," Richard glanced at his daughter. "Wanted to know if you were spoken for yet." "And what did you tell him?" "The truth, that you're engaged to be married in the spring, to a man who has earned both your affection and my respect." He smiled slightly at Tessa's startled expression. "Don't look so surprised, daughter. I may be cautious, but I'm not blind. Irving has proven himself in ways I didn't think possible when he first arrived." Warmth spread through Tessa's chest at this unexpected endorsement. "Thank you, Papa, that means more than you know." "Your mother would have liked him," Richard added softly. "She always had an eye for genuine character beneath rough exteriors." The comparison to her mother, the highest praise her father could bestow, brought tears to Tessa's eyes. She crossed to where he sat, kneeling beside his chair to embrace him with fierce gratitude. "I'll miss you terribly," she whispered against his shoulder. Richard's arms tightened around her. "You'll be 5 miles away, not across the country. And this store has plenty of room for grandchildren to visit." The mention of children, of a family beyond just her and Ethan, sent a flutter of nervous excitement through Tessa's stomach. So much would change with marriage, with the creation of a new household, perhaps eventually with motherhood. Yet alongside natural trepidation ran a current of absolute certainty about the path she had chosen. Ethan Irving might have believed he had nothing to offer, but Tessa had recognized from their earliest encounters the wealth he carried within: integrity, courage, gentleness beneath necessary strength, and a capacity for love that had survived despite profound loss. These qualities, rather than material possessions or social position, formed the foundation upon which she was willing to build a life. As February yielded reluctantly to March, bringing longer days and occasional thaws that hinted at spring's approach, activity at the new house accelerated. On Sundays after church, weather permitting, Tessa would accompany Ethan to the building site, offering opinions on finishes and layouts that he incorporated with careful attention. "The study should have shelves along this wall," she suggested one such afternoon, standing in what would become a book-lined retreat, "for your journals and whatever books we collect over the years." Ethan looked up from where he was installing window trim, his expression curious. "My journals? I don't keep journals, Tessa." "Not yet," she replied with a smile. "But you have stories worth preserving, experiences future generations might value. Our children should know their father's journey." Something shifted in his eyes at the mention of children, a softening, a vulnerability quickly masked but not before Tessa glimpsed it. "You think they'd want to know about a drifter who took too long finding his way home. I think they'll want to know about a man who survived terrible loss, who found the courage to trust again, who built something meaningful from nothing." She crossed to where he worked, placing a hand on his arm. "Your story matters, Ethan, all of it, the wandering years included." He covered her hand with his, work-roughened fingers gentle against her skin. "Sometimes I still can't believe you chose me," he said quietly. "That you saw something worth believing in when I had stopped believing in myself." "I saw everything I ever wanted," Tessa replied simply. "A good man with a good heart trying his best in a difficult world. What more could anyone ask for?" The kiss they shared, still rare enough to send warmth coursing through Tessa's veins, held promises that transcended words. When they parted, Ethan's eyes remained on hers, serious and intent. "The house will be finished by the end of April," he said. "Habitable at least, though there will always be improvements to make." He hesitated, then added, "If that timeline suits you, I thought perhaps a June wedding. When the wildflowers bloom in the meadow beyond the creek." The specificity of his suggestion, not just a season but a precise setting, touched Tessa deeply. This man who had once avoided all planning beyond the next departure was now envisioning their wedding day with careful attention to detail. "June would be perfect," she agreed, her heart full. "The first Sunday after the spring cattle drive returns so everyone can attend." As they continued discussing plans that afternoon, practical matters of furniture and schedules intermingled with dreams for the years ahead, Tessa felt a profound gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this point. From a chance encounter in a mercantile to a shared future taking physical shape around them, their story had unfolded with unexpected grace. The wanderer had found his home. The merchant's daughter had found adventure without leaving Whiterock. Together, they were creating something neither could have built alone, a life that honored both roots and wings, security and possibility, past experiences and future hopes. April arrived with renewed energy as nature awakened from winter's grip. Snow retreated to shaded hollows and north-facing slopes, creeks swelled with runoff, and the first tentative green appeared in meadows surrounding Whiterock. With the changing season came increased activity throughout the territory. Preparations for spring planting, cattle drives organized, and building projects resumed after the winter pause. For Ethan, the warming weather brought both satisfaction and a familiar restlessness that surprised him with its diminished power. Where once the open trails of spring had called to him with irresistible force, now they represented merely routes connecting him to Whiterock rather than escape paths from responsibility. The house beside the creek stood nearly complete, windows installed, roof shingled, interior walls plastered and awaiting paint. Ethan divided his time between final construction tasks and his duties at Peterson's ranch, where preparations for the spring cattle drive consumed increasing hours. "You'll be trail boss this year," Peterson informed him one morning as they surveyed the growing herd. "Hank's knee won't handle 6 weeks in the saddle, and you've proven yourself capable of handling men as well as you handle horses." The promotion, unexpected and significant, left Ethan momentarily speechless. Trail boss was a position of substantial responsibility, typically reserved for men who had been with a ranch for years rather than months. "I appreciate your confidence," he said finally, "but I'm scheduled to marry in June. The drive won't return until mid-July at earliest." Peterson chuckled, clapping him on the shoulder. "Already discussed it with your intended and her father. The wedding will wait for your return, and you'll have a proper honeymoon fund from the bonus you'll earn as trail boss." His expression grew more serious. "Unless you'd prefer not to take the position." Ethan considered the offer carefully. The responsibility was significant, the journey challenging, the delay to his wedding disappointing. Yet the opportunity to prove himself in this capacity, to cement his position at the ranch and provide more substantially for Tessa, held undeniable appeal. "I'll do it," he decided. "If Tessa is truly willing to delay the wedding." "She's a remarkable woman," Peterson replied with approval. "Said she'd wait until fall if necessary, though I assured her July would be the latest you'd return." That evening, Ethan rode to town, needing to confirm this arrangement with Tessa directly. He found her at the mercantile, helping a young mother select fabric for children's clothing. The sight of her, golden hair escaping its pins as she bent over bolts of calico, patience evident in her expression as she answered the customer's questions, filled him with a warmth that still surprised him after months of courtship. When the customer departed, Tessa turned toward him with the smile that never failed to quicken his pulse. "You heard about the trail boss position," she said, reading his expression accurately. "Peterson told me he'd spoken with you already," Ethan replied, crossing to where she stood. "Are you truly comfortable delaying the wedding, Tessa? 6 weeks is a long time to be apart." "It's 6 weeks that will establish your place at the ranch more firmly," she countered, reaching to straighten his collar with familiar affection, "and provide additional funds for our start together. Those are worthy reasons to wait a little longer." Ethan captured her hand, pressing it gently. "I'd marry you tomorrow in your father's storeroom if that's what you wanted." Her laugh, musical and genuine, lightened his concerns. "And deny Mrs. Henderson and the church ladies their opportunity to create the social event of the season, they'd never forgive us." Her expression sobered slightly, her hands resting against his chest. "Go, Ethan, do this job. Show my father and yourself that you're the man for it. I'll be here when you return." "I will," he promised, the vow settling deep in his bones. "I'll be back before the first hay is cut." He kissed her then, oblivious to who might be watching through the mercantile windows. It was a kiss of promise, of temporary parting rather than final goodbye, a distinction that made all the difference in the world to a man who had spent a lifetime saying farewell. The cattle drive proved to be everything Peterson had predicted and more, a grueling test of endurance, skill, and leadership. For 6 weeks, Ethan lived in the saddle, breathing dust, eating trail rations, and sleeping with one eye open against the threat of predators and rustlers. The responsibility of the herd and the men under his command weighed heavily, yet he carried it with a new kind of strength. In years past, the open trail had been his escape, the horizon a lure promising freedom from attachment. Now, however, the endless miles were simply distance to be conquered, obstacles between him and the home waiting in Whiterock. During the long night watches, while the herd slept under the vast canopy of stars, Ethan found himself not plotting his next destination, but mentally cataloging the finishing touches needed for the house. A bookshelf for the study, a rocking chair for the porch, a garden trellis for the roses Tessa loved. He wasn't drifting anymore, he was commuting. The drive reached the railhead in Wyoming without significant loss, a feat that earned Ethan the grudging respect of the older hands who had initially questioned Peterson's choice of trail boss. The sale was negotiated, the cattle loaded, and the substantial proceeds secured in the bank draft Peterson had entrusted him to carry. "You handle men well, Irving," old Hank commented as they sat in the saloon that final night before heading home, nursing celebratory whiskeys. "Fair but firm, men respect that." "Just wanted to get the job done and get home," Ethan replied, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. Hank grinned, his leathery face creasing. "Home. That's a new word in your vocabulary, ain't it?" "It is," Ethan admitted, realizing with a jolt of surprise how easily the word had come to his lips. "But I reckon it's one I'll be using a lot from now on." The journey back to Montana was a race against Ethan's own impatience. He pushed the pace where safe, eager to close the distance, yet disciplined enough to spare the horses. As the familiar landmarks of the territory began to appear, the distant peaks of the range, the winding path of the river, the specific shade of green that marked the valley floor, Ethan felt a tightening in his chest that had nothing to do with anxiety and everything to do with anticipation. They crested the final ridge above Whiterock on a Tuesday afternoon in mid-July. The town lay spread out below them, bathed in golden summer light, looking exactly as he had pictured it during those lonely nights on the trail. But it wasn't the buildings that drew his eye, it was the knowledge of who waited within them. Leaving the men to take the horses on to the ranch, Ethan rode directly to the mercantile. He didn't bother to brush the trail dust from his clothes or shave the weeks of growth from his face. He needed to see her first. He tied Storm to the familiar hitching post and stepped through the door. The bell jingled, a sound that had become the soundtrack of his new life, and Tessa looked up from a display of ribbons she was arranging. For a second she simply stared, taking in the travel-worn man standing in her doorway. Then, with a cry of pure joy that banished the last of his trail weariness, she abandoned the ribbons and ran to him. Ethan caught her, lifting her off her feet as he buried his face in the curve of her neck, breathing in the scent of lavender and home. "You're back," she whispered against his shoulder. "You're really back." "I told you," he rasped, setting her down but refusing to let her go. "I had a promise to keep." Richard Palmer emerged from the back room, adjusting his spectacles. He stopped when he saw them, a slow smile spreading across his face. "Well," the older man said, his voice thick with emotion, "I suppose we should start planning a wedding, Mrs. Henderson has been pacing for weeks." The wedding took place 3 weeks later, on a day when the Montana sky was a blue so deep it seemed infinite. The church was filled to capacity, the windows thrown open to catch the summer breeze. Ethan stood at the altar, uncomfortable in his new suit but steady in his resolve. Beside him stood Peterson as his best man, a mark of the bond that had formed between employer and foreman. But Ethan barely noticed the crowd or the heat. His entire world had narrowed to the back of the church, where the doors were just opening. When Tessa appeared on her father's arm, wearing a dress of cream silk she and the church ladies had spent months sewing, Ethan forgot how to breathe. She was radiant, her golden hair crowned with wildflowers, her eyes fixed on him with a look of such absolute love that he felt unworthy and invincible all at once. As she reached his side, Richard Palmer placed her hand in Ethan's. "She chose well," Richard whispered, gripping Ethan's hand firmly before stepping back. The ceremony passed in a blur of sacred words and shared vows, but the moment Ethan slid the simple gold band onto Tessa's finger stood out with crystalline clarity. With that ring and the words, "With this ring I thee wed," the last remnants of the solitary drifter finally fell away. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the minister declared. Ethan kissed his bride, not tentatively as he had on Christmas Eve, but with the passion of a man claiming his destiny. The cheers of the congregation, his neighbors, his friends, his community, rose around them, a joyous chorus welcoming them into their new life. The reception was held in the meadow beside the newly finished house by the creek. Tables groaned under the weight of food provided by every family in Whiterock. Fiddles played, children ran through the tall grass, and laughter floated on the evening air. As twilight fell, Ethan and Tessa slipped away from the celebration, walking hand in hand toward the porch of their home. The house stood sturdy and welcoming, its windows reflecting the lantern light from the party, its chimney promising warmth against future winters. Ethan stopped at the bottom of the steps, turning Tessa to face him. He looked at the house he had built with his own hands, then at the woman who had given him the reason to build it. "It's not a mansion," he said softly, the old insecurity surfacing one last time. "And I'm still just a ranch foreman." Tessa reached up, smoothing the lapels of his coat. "Ethan Irving, look at me." He met her gaze, drowning in the green depths of her eyes. "You gave me a home when you built this house," she said fiercely. "You gave me adventure when you shared your stories. You gave me safety when you stayed. Do you really think I care about mansions?" She took his hand and placed it over her heart. "You offered me everything, Ethan, even when you thought you had nothing." Ethan covered her hand with his own, feeling the steady beat of her heart, a rhythm that would mark the time of the rest of his life. He thought of the boy who had walked away from a frozen cabin 13 years ago, convinced he had nothing left to lose because he had nothing left to love. He looked at his wife at his home, at the stars wheeling overhead in the vast Montana sky. "I love you," he whispered, the words carrying the weight of a lifetime of silence finally broken. "I know," she smiled, turning to open the door to their future. "Welcome home, Cowboy." 5 years later. The winter of 1873 was fierce, though not as brutal as the one that had haunted Ethan's nightmares for so long. The snow lay deep around the house by the creek, banking against the walls and turning the world into a sculpture of ice and silence. Inside, however, the fire roared in the stone hearth, casting a golden light over the room. Ethan sat in the rocking chair he had built during that first courtship winter, a small, warm weight resting against his chest. His 3-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, was fast asleep, her golden hair, so like her mother's, spilled across his flannel shirt. Across the room, Tessa sat at the table, the leather-bound journal open before her as she wrote by lamplight. She paused, looking up to catch him watching her. The years had added a few lines to her face, marks of laughter and worry and life lived fully, but to Ethan she was even more beautiful than the girl he had met in the mercantile. "What are you writing?" he asked softly, careful not to wake the child. "Ideally a record of the winter supplies," she replied with a smile, "but mostly just thoughts. About how lucky we are." She stood and came to him, resting her hand on his shoulder as she looked down at their sleeping daughter. "Papa came by today while you were at the barns," she whispered. "He brought those fabric samples for the new curtains." "He shouldn't be out in this cold," Ethan scolded gently, though he smiled. Richard Palmer doted on his granddaughter and visited as often as the weather allowed, often finding excuses to bring necessary items from the store. "He wanted to see us. He said the town feels empty when the snow gets this deep." Ethan looked around the room, at the books lining the shelves he had built, the rug Tessa had braided, the toys scattered on the hearth. He listened to the wind howling outside, a sound that used to fill him with terror and the urge to run. Now, it simply made him appreciate the warmth of the fire and the weight of the child in his arms. He wasn't wealthy by the world's standards. He worked hard every day, managing Peterson's horses and his own small but growing herd. His hands were rough, his days long, and the frontier remained a challenging place to raise a family. But as he looked up at his wife, seeing the love that had never wavered, not once, since she had bandaged his arm in a storeroom, Ethan knew the truth. The drifter who had nothing to offer had become the richest man in the territory. "Let it snow," he murmured, leaning his head against Tessa's hand. "We're right where we belong."